Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It was late afternoon when I moved into the new apartment. I was tired after the long day of packing and arranging things in the unfamiliar space. The place seemed ordinary at first glance, but something felt off, like the air was a little too still, too quiet. A new beginning, I told myself, but a nagging feeling tugged at my mind. I'd found this apartment through a listing on a small, almost forgotten website. The price was perfect, the location was close to work, and everything about it seemed just right. There was no sign of anything unusual at first. The walls were a dull shade of beige, the floor creaked just enough to remind me it was old, but not in a way that felt dangerous. It was as if the apartment had been waiting for me, for years, to step inside. But then, it happened. That evening, after unpacking the last of my boxes, I noticed a small detail that I hadn't caught before. The door to the apartment complex's hallway, the one that led to the stairwell, was missing a number. The apartment I rented was supposed to be number 12, but there was no plaque, no sign on the door. The hallway seemed strangely empty, too, as if no one had been there for a long time. I shook my head, thinking it was just a detail that had been overlooked. But that feeling, the one I couldn't quite place, lingered. I spent the first few days settling in, trying to adjust to the rhythm of the new place. My neighbors didn't seem too friendly, but they weren't unfriendly either. Everyone kept to themselves. When I ran into them in the hallway, they would smile curtly and then quickly walk away, avoiding eye contact. At first, I thought I was just overthinking it. After all, people in big cities didn't always have the time or energy to be sociable. But the strange isolation started to wear on me. It was as if they weren't just indifferent, they were actively avoiding me. One night, while making myself a late dinner, I heard something that made me freeze. A soft sound, like the rustle of fabric. I couldn't place it at first. Maybe it was the wind, I thought. But then I realized the air was completely still. No draft. Nothing that could explain the sound. I turned off the stove and listened intently. It came again. A faint rustle. Then, a soft creak. My eyes darted toward the hallway. There was nothing there. No sign of movement. But I felt it, the sensation that something, or someone, was out there. I tried to brush it off. The apartment was old. It probably creaked and moaned with the settling of the floors. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finished my meal quickly and went to bed, trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. It wasn't until the following night that I understood what was happening. The door to my apartment, the one I had locked before going to sleep, was open when I woke up. At first, I thought I had simply forgotten to lock it. But as I stepped into the living room, the sight of the door wide open hit me like a cold shock. The hallway was dark, and I could barely make out the faint outline of the stairs leading down. The air in the hallway felt different, colder, thicker, almost suffocating. I walked over and closed the door, double-checking that it was locked. The next day, I asked the building superintendent about it. I thought maybe the locks were faulty or there was some sort of misunderstanding. But when I described the incident, the superintendent gave me a puzzled look. "You're the only one in that apartment, right?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, confused. "The building's not supposed to have an apartment there," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one could hear. I blinked, unsure if I heard her correctly. "What do you mean?" "I'm in apartment 12. She shook her head slowly. "There is no apartment 12. The building only has 11 floors, 11 apartments. The floor plan never had a 12. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe she was mistaken. Maybe she didn't know the building well enough. But something in the way she looked at me told me she wasn't lying. The realization hit me like a wave. I was living in a place that didn't officially exist. I went back to my apartment that day, feeling a cold sweat form on my brow. I thought about leaving, about finding somewhere else to stay. But the strange allure of the apartment, of its silence, pulled me in. I wasn't sure why, but the idea of leaving felt impossible, like something was keeping me there. That night, I heard it again, the rustling. But this time, it was louder, more insistent, like someone was pacing outside my door. I crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The faint light from the hallway barely reached my apartment, casting long shadows on the floor. My hand trembled as I touched the doorknob, ready to pull it open and confront whatever was out there. But as I reached for it, the sound stopped. The air felt even thicker now. The silence that followed felt more oppressive than the noise. And then, the door creaked open on its own. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, watching as the door opened wider and wider, revealing the darkness beyond. Something was coming. Something I couldn't see, but could feel closing on me. What had I gotten myself into? The door stood wide open, and the darkness of the hallway stretched beyond it, an endless void that seemed to pull at my very soul. The air in the apartment had turned cold, a biting chill that made my breath visible. My heart pounded loudly in my chest, and I fought the urge to scream. I had to close the door. I had to stop whatever was happening. But my body wouldn't move. It was as if the room had frozen, my legs weighed down by an invisible force. I stared into the darkness, my eyes adjusting to the dim light coming from the hallway. The faint rustling from before had stopped, but the stillness only made it worse. The silence felt like something was waiting, listening, watching me. I finally willed myself to step forward. My legs were stiff, reluctant, but I forced them to carry me. Slowly, I approached the open door, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal of the doorknob. Just as I touched it, I heard a faint sound, a soft whisper. My breath hitched. It was as though someone had spoken my name. The whisper was barely audible, just a breath of sound, but it was unmistakable. I jerked my hand back from the knob, panic rising in my chest. I could feel the presence on the other side of the door now. Something was there, waiting for me. I could sense it in the way the air seemed to thicken, like the entire world had drawn a breath and was holding it. It wasn't just the silence. It was the absence of sound, the eerie quiet that seemed unnatural. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a force that made the walls shake. I stumbled back, my heart racing. My breathing became shallow as I tried to process what had just happened. How could the door close on its own like that? I hadn't even touched it. I stood frozen in place for what felt like hours, my mind racing. The apartment was still. Too still. I felt like I was being suffocated by the quiet, as though the walls were closing in on me. The whole situation didn't make sense. I thought back to the conversation with the superintendent earlier that day. There is no apartment 12, her words echoed in my mind. Was I going crazy? Had I imagined the whole thing? Or was something much worse going on here? I turned away from the door, my back pressed against the wall, trying to find some comfort in the familiar space of my living room. But there was none. I could feel the eyes of the apartment on me, the oppressive gaze of something that didn't belong. I tried to distract myself. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through social media, searching for anything that might take my mind off the growing unease. But my phone screen kept flickering, the images glitching and distorting as if the device itself was struggling to function properly. Then, my screen went black. It wasn't the usual screen going out due to a malfunction, it was as if the phone had simply ceased to exist. I pressed the power button repeatedly, but nothing happened. In the dead silence of the room, the absence of sound from the phone was more disturbing than the noise it had made before. I placed it on the table with a trembling hand, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe the stress of moving had made me overly sensitive. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I could feel it in the air, something was happening. Something was wrong with this place. I looked at the clock. It was just past midnight. I got up and walked toward the kitchen, needing to get away from the oppressive atmosphere of the living room. The kitchen, with its flickering fluorescent light and sterile white walls, should have been comforting. But as I crossed the threshold into the space, I felt it again, the sensation of being watched. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the hallway. But there was nothing. Nothing except the faintest whisper. "It's coming." I froze in place, my blood turning cold. That voice. It wasn't in my head. It wasn't a trick of my mind. Someone, or something, was speaking to me. And it wasn't coming from inside the apartment. It was coming from the hallway. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my body shaking with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Slowly, I forced myself to turn around and walk back toward the hallway. Each step felt like it was taking me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. The door to my apartment was still shut, but the hallway beyond it felt wrong. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, as if they were reaching toward me. I could feel them, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to look into the blackness. But my hand moved on its own, as if some force was pulling me toward it. When I reached for the doorknob, I felt it again, the cold, clammy grip of something not quite human. My heart raced, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned the knob. The door swung open with a creak, revealing the empty hallway. But it wasn't empty anymore. Standing in the middle of the hallway was a figure, a shape that was impossible to make out, yet unmistakably there. Its form was vague, shifting in the dim light, like a mirage that my eyes couldn't focus on. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze. It was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The figure took a slow step forward, and I could feel the pressure in the air growing heavier, pressing against me from all sides. It was as if the entire apartment was closing in around me, suffocating me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The hallway was empty once more. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what this place was. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. And whatever was here, it wasn't going to let me leave. The door was locked. I was sure of it. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking just beyond the threshold. My mind raced as I pressed my back against the door, my breath shallow. The figure in the hallway, it had been real. I hadn't imagined it. I wasn't going crazy. But if it wasn't a figment of my imagination, what was it? And why was it here? I stumbled back into the apartment, away from the door, and collapsed onto the couch. My hands shook as I clutched the edge of the cushion, trying to steady myself. The apartment, once so familiar, now felt like a prison. I couldn't escape the feeling that the walls themselves were watching me, listening to every breath I took. I looked around the room, half expecting to see eyes peering from the shadows, but there was nothing. Nothing except the oppressive silence. I turned my gaze toward the clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. My mind was a jumble of thoughts, but I knew I couldn't sleep, not now. Not with whatever was out there. The fear was consuming me, gnawing at my insides, but I couldn't escape it. I wasn't sure what I was running from anymore, only that I had to do something. But what? I needed answers. I stood up and walked toward the window. I pulled back the curtain and stared into the night. The building across the street was dark, its windows blank and lifeless. The city outside seemed distant, removed from the strange reality that had enveloped me. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing against me, as though the entire world had stopped moving, holding its breath. That's when I heard it again. A soft tapping. It was faint at first, like a distant knock. Then it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from inside the apartment. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, my eyes searching the room for the source of the sound. The walls seemed to stretch and bend in the dim light, distorting as if the apartment itself was warping around me. The tapping continued, louder now, rhythmic. Tap. 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 I felt the cold touch of dread crawling up my spine. The sound wasn't coming from the door this time. It was coming from the walls. I backed away from the window, the tapping growing louder with each step I took. I couldn't escape it. My hands trembled as I tried to steady myself, but the fear kept building, a wave crashing over me. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the apartment was holding its breath, waiting for something. For me. I had to find out what was happening. I had to understand what I was dealing with. I grabbed my coat and walked toward the hallway, my footsteps heavy on the creaky floor. The apartment stretched before me, an endless labyrinth of corridors, and I had no idea where to turn. But I had to go deeper. As I walked into the hallway, I felt the temperature drop, the air growing colder with each step. The hallway stretched out in front of me, its dark corners twisting like shadows. My pulse quickened. I reached for the light switch, but as I touched it, the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into total darkness. I froze. The sound of my own breathing was the only thing I could hear now, the air thick and heavy around me. The darkness felt alive, closing in on me, suffocating me. I reached out, my hands brushing against the walls, but the texture of the surface was wrong, too smooth, too cold. It felt like I was touching something, alive. I recoiled and took a step back, my eyes desperately trying to adjust to the dark. But then, I felt it. A shift in the air. A change in the space around me. The walls seemed to breathe. The floor beneath me groaned, and I stumbled forward, barely catching myself. But it wasn't the apartment settling. No, it was something else. Something alive. I heard it then, a low, guttural whisper that came from every direction. It wasn't words, not exactly, but the sound carried an unmistakable intent. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking to me. I couldn't make out the meaning, but the tone was clear. It was not friendly. The walls shifted again, and I felt a strange pressure against my chest, as if the very space was pushing on me, tightening with every breath I took. My skin crawled, and I turned to flee, but the hallway seemed endless, stretching out before me like an impossible maze. I didn't know which way to go. Every direction felt wrong. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It was the same shape, the same figure I had seen before. But this time, it was moving. It was coming toward me. My heart stopped. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was getting closer, its form still shifting, never fully revealing itself, yet unmistakably there. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and the air grew colder still. The walls were closing in, tightening around me. The figure was nearly upon me. In a desperate rush, I bolted. I ran down the hallway, not knowing where I was going, just trying to get away. My footfalls echoed, deafening in the silence. The apartment seemed to stretch farther and farther, the walls closing in on me, the figure still following, its shape flickering in the darkness. I could feel it. It was right behind me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, I reached the door to my apartment. I fumbled for the doorknob, my fingers slick with sweat, but it wouldn't open. The door was locked. I pounded against it, my breath ragged, my heart beating wildly in my chest. But then, with a sickening twist, the door creaked open on its own. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me, but I knew it wasn't over. The air inside was still cold, and the walls still felt wrong. I could hear the faint rustling again, the whispering, but this time it was louder, closer. I collapsed against the wall, my eyes wide with terror. Whatever had been following me, whatever was in this place, was not going to let me leave. I was breathing too fast, too shallow. My chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself, each breath pulling at my lungs with a force I couldn't control. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the couch, trying to steady myself. The apartment was silent now, but not the comfortable kind of silence. It was thick, suffocating, as if the air itself had become heavier, pressing down on me. I could hear nothing, but I felt everything. A sense of being watched followed me from every corner of the room, like eyes, unseen, yet very much present, were studying my every move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. Something was moving in the space between the walls. I could feel it in my bones, that strange, unsettling pressure. It wasn't just the silence, it was the lack of life. I felt completely alone in a way I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't that there were no other people. It wasn't that the building was empty. It was something else, something darker. I tried to calm myself down. I couldn't just fall apart. I had to think. I needed to understand what was happening. I turned toward the phone, the one that had gone black earlier. It was still lifeless, lying on the table where I had left it. I walked over and pressed the power button once more. It flickered, then turned on with a soft hum. The screen glowed, casting an eerie light across the room. My heart skipped when I saw that the home screen was filled with new notifications, dozens of messages, emails, missed calls. The strange thing? They were all from the same number. A number I didn't recognize. I opened one of the messages, the text blinking on the screen as though it was being typed in real time. You shouldn't have come here. My breath caught in my throat. I closed the message in a panic and opened the next one. The door will open again. I slammed the phone down onto the table, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Whoever, or whatever, was sending these messages knew where I was. And they knew things that I hadn't told anyone. The door. That's what they had mentioned. The door. The one that opened by itself. I stared at the door. It was locked. I knew I had locked it. But the door didn't care about locks. It had opened on its own before, as though it was being pulled from the other side. I backed away slowly, my feet dragging across the floor. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run, to get out of this place. But I couldn't. I felt paralyzed by fear, as if something was keeping me rooted to the spot. I looked around the apartment once more, my eyes darting from corner to corner, expecting to see something move, something shift. The space had grown darker, the shadows now stretching long across the floor like dark fingers reaching toward me. The whispering began again. Soft, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. You shouldn't have come here. I gasped, whirling around, my eyes wide with panic. The voice was in the room with me, in my ears, in my mind. I could hear it coming from all directions, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating fog. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me, and I fell to the floor. The whispers were growing louder, echoing off the walls, drowning out everything else. My heart was pounding in my ears, my skin prickling with cold. It felt like the apartment itself was alive, like it was breathing with me, drawing me deeper into its dark, suffocating grasp. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the whispering stopped. A complete silence filled the room. It was as if everything had frozen. I slowly stood up, my mind racing. This was it. I had to leave. But when I turned to the door, I saw it. The door was open again. The door that had been locked. The door that had closed behind me just moments ago. It was wide open now, as though someone, or something, had reached through the walls to turn the knob and pull it open. The hallway beyond it was just as dark as before. The shadows in the corridor seemed to writhe, twisting and curling around the light from the apartment. I could feel the cold air from the hallway creeping in, filling the room with an unnatural chill. The apartment was no longer just an empty space, it felt like a trap. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, every nerve on fire with panic. The whispers returned, louder now, growing sharper, more insistent. Come. The word was like a command, a force that tugged at my chest, urging me to step forward, to walk through that door into the black void beyond. I couldn't stop it. My feet moved on their own, as though I had no control over them. The whispers were louder now, no longer distant but close, right behind me. I stepped into the hallway, the darkness enveloping me. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive weight. My breath came in shallow gasps as I walked, unsure of where I was going, only that I had no choice but to keep moving. The walls around me felt like they were closing in, the shadows stretching farther with each step I took. And then, as if from nowhere, I heard the sound again. A soft tapping. Tap. 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 I stopped in my tracks, my body tensing with fear. It was coming from the walls again. The sound echoed all around me, a rhythmic, hollow noise that seemed to pulse with an eerie life of its own. It wasn't just tapping anymore. It had turned into something else, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. And they were getting closer. I turned, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. The footsteps weren't real, yet they were undeniable. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I was being followed. And then, just as I reached the end of the hallway, I felt it. A cold hand, no, not a hand, but something much worse, reached out of the shadows and touched my shoulder. The cold burned through me, as though I was being marked, branded by whatever haunted this place. I turned in a panic, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the suffocating dark. And the whispering. It was louder now, closer than ever. You will never leave. I couldn't breathe. The air had thickened again, pressing down on my chest, the walls around me tightening as if the apartment was closing in on me, suffocating me. The cold from the touch on my shoulder lingered, burning through my skin, sending a chill straight to my bones. It wasn't the kind of cold you could shake off. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your soul and left it numb. I turned quickly, expecting to see something, a shadow, a figure, anything, but the hallway was still empty. The darkness stretched before me, its silence oppressive and suffocating. The footsteps, the tapping, the whispers, all of it had stopped. But I knew it wasn't over. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and every instinct in me screamed to turn back. To run. But where would I go? This place, this apartment, was alive. It wasn't a building anymore. It was a trap, and it had no intention of letting me leave. My legs felt heavy, unwilling to move, but somehow I found myself taking one step forward. The floor groaned beneath me as I walked, and the shadows seemed to deepen, pulling me in. The whispering had returned, softer this time, almost like a distant hum. You are not supposed to be here. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. The voice was closer than it had ever been, wrapping around me like a shroud. I could feel it in my head now, inside my mind, as though it was speaking directly to my thoughts. My stomach churned. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I took another step. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, standing in the shadows, was a figure. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes. I could feel it watching me. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its shape was wrong, twisted and contorted, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. It had a presence, a weight that I could feel in my bones. You cannot leave, it whispered. The voice was familiar, like the one from the messages, low, cold, and filled with a terrible knowing. I froze. My body locked in place. I wanted to run, to scream, but it was like my legs had turned to stone. The darkness around me pressed in, and the figure moved. Slowly, silently, it advanced toward me, its form becoming clearer with each step. Its face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel it. The thing was smiling. A twisted, impossible smile that stretched across its face like a grotesque mask. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence returned, deafening. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the thing in the dark, but it felt like hours. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was none. There was no escape from this nightmare. The figure raised one hand, and for a brief moment, I thought it might reach out to touch me, to pull me into whatever hell it came from. But instead, It pointed toward the door of my apartment, the one that had opened earlier. It gestured, as though urging me to go. Without thinking, I turned toward the door. But the hallway stretched longer now. It felt like it was moving away from me, growing longer with every step I took. The door that had been within reach only moments ago was now far, far away. Tom. The voice was unmistakable now. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command, a demand. And it wasn't coming from the figure anymore. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the very air around me. The apartment was speaking to me, drawing me closer, pulling me into its depths. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my feet stumbling on the floor, my chest burning with every breath. The hallway twisted and shifted, the walls stretching like elastic, warping around me. The door was still so far away, and the whispers, they were louder now, more insistent. I could hear them in my ears, in my mind. You will never leave. I reached out for the door, my hand shaking as I touched the doorknob. It was cold, colder than before. The metal burned against my skin, but I didn't care. I twisted the knob, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked. I pulled harder. Nothing. The whispers were growing louder, merging into one deafening scream. The apartment was shaking now, its walls groaning as if the entire building were alive, writhing in agony. The floor beneath me trembled, and the lights flickered, casting strange, erratic shadows. I heard footsteps. They were behind me again. They weren't mine. They were the footsteps of something else, something that was closing in. The figure was behind me, its presence unbearable, and I knew it was coming to claim me. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard it. The door, the one that had been locked, slowly creaked open. I didn't think. I didn't question it. I shoved the door wide open and stepped through. The hallway vanished behind me, the oppressive darkness lifting. I stumbled into the next room, gasping for air, my heart racing. I couldn't hear the whispers anymore. I couldn't hear the footsteps. The silence was all-encompassing now, thick and suffocating. I turned around, expecting to see the hallway behind me, but instead, I saw a room I didn't recognize. The walls were unfamiliar, the furniture strange. I was no longer in the apartment I had moved into. I wasn't even sure I was in the same building anymore. The door behind me slammed shut with a force that made me jump. The room felt cold, so cold I could see my breath in the air. And in the corner of the room, there was a figure. It was the same figure. And it was smiling at me. You should never have come here, it whispered. But now you're part of it. And just like that, the door to the room slammed shut. The world went black. I never left the apartment. No one has seen me since. And I don't think anyone ever will. The apartment still stands, but it's not in any of the city's records anymore. It doesn't exist, or maybe it never did. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the whispers. They're always just behind me, waiting, watching. And it doesn't matter where I go, because it's always there. Have you ever wondered if something is wrong, but you can't quite figure out what it is? You know that feeling, the one where everything seems just slightly off, as if the world around you has shifted, but you don't have the proof to say why. It's a strange sensation, like hearing footsteps behind you when no one is there, or catching a glimpse of movement in the corner of your eye, only to turn around and find nothing. I didn't know then, but that feeling would soon be the least of my worries. It started innocently enough. I had just moved into a new apartment, an old building, a bit worn, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was on the top floor, which gave me a certain sense of privacy and quiet, away from the hustle of the city below. The place seemed perfect, in a way. Spacious, affordable, and secluded. But, like all things that seemed too good to be true, it wasn't long before I started to feel that sense of unease. At first, it was small things. The neighbors didn't seem to notice me, not in the way I expected. When I passed them in the hallway, their eyes would shift quickly to the floor, or they'd pretend to be busy with something, anything, really. It was odd. There wasn't any hostility in their avoidance, just a quiet indifference, as if they didn't want to acknowledge my presence at all. I tried not to think too much of it. People have their own lives, their own problems. But one evening, as I unpacked the last of my boxes in the living room, I began to hear something that would change everything. It was faint at first. A low, muffled noise coming from above, like a scraping sound. I paused, holding my breath. The apartment above mine was empty, or so I thought. I had seen no one come or go since I moved in. Still, I convinced myself it was probably just the building settling or the wind carrying the sound through the pipes. But it didn't stop. The sound continued, growing louder as the days passed. A scratching, dragging noise that would start as soon as the sun went down. I couldn't figure out what it was, but it sounded too deliberate to be random. Too alive. As though something, or someone, was moving around on the roof just above my head. I checked the roof door once, but it was locked. There was no way to get up there, not without proper access, which I didn't have. Still, the noises persisted. They seemed to come in waves, as if something was pacing the length of the roof, scratching along the surface, dragging something heavy. It wasn't a sound that could be easily ignored. One evening, after hearing the noise again, I stood by the window, staring up at the dark sky. The building was tall enough that I could see the outline of the roof. There was no movement, no sign of anything that might explain the sound. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was up there. Watching. Waiting. The noise began to change. The faint scratching was replaced by something heavier, more rhythmic, like the sound of boots dragging across the roof. My skin prickled, and I instinctively checked the door, the one that led out to the hallway. It was still locked. I tried calling the landlord the next day, but his number was out of service. I thought maybe I should speak to the neighbors, but each time I passed them, they avoided my gaze, like they knew something I didn't. My presence seemed to irritate them in a way I couldn't understand. Then, one night, it happened. The door to my apartment creaked open. I stood frozen, staring at it. I hadn't touched the handle. I hadn't even moved from the couch where I was sitting, the television still playing softly in the background. My heart raced. There was no wind, no draft that could explain the door opening on its own. I stood up slowly, cautious. The door was fully open now, and I felt a chill in the air, an unnatural cold that seemed to seep from the hallway. I walked over, my legs heavy with dread. I closed the door again, locking it this time, just to be sure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds on the roof. It was louder now, unmistakable. There was no wind, no storm. It was just movement. Heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing above me. And then I heard something even worse. The creak of the door opening again. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. There it was again, the sound of the door moving slowly, as though someone were gently pushing it open. But there was no one there. No one in the hallway. No one in the apartment. I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. I had to leave. I had to get away from whatever was causing the sounds, from whatever was opening the door. But when I reached for my keys, ready to bolt, I heard it, the noise on the roof again, louder now, more frantic. The dragging, scraping sound was accompanied by a new noise, a soft whispering, almost as if it was coming from the walls. "Come closer." The voice was barely audible, but it was there. It was real. I turned toward the door again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I bolted for it, ready to leave this nightmare behind. But as I reached the door, I heard something else, a sound that froze me in my tracks. The unmistakable click of the lock turning on its own. I stood there, my breath shallow, my body trembling with fear, as I realized whatever was in this building, whatever was making those noises, wasn't just in the apartment. It had been waiting for me to arrive. And it wasn't going to let me leave. The air in the apartment felt thicker the next day, like the walls themselves were closing in. I spent the entire morning walking in circles, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that gripped me, but it wouldn't go away. I wanted to leave, but something kept me here. Maybe it was the rent, maybe it was because I didn't know where else to go. Either way, it didn't matter. I was trapped. I tried to get some sleep, but the whispering sounds from the roof kept me awake. They weren't the same as before. There was a new layer to them now, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was almost as if the sounds were closer, like they were no longer on the roof but directly above me, in the ceiling, shifting and scraping just inches from where I lay. I gripped the blankets tightly, as though holding onto them could somehow hold off whatever was moving in the darkness above. I couldn't sleep. It was impossible. The next day, I decided to go upstairs and talk to the neighbor who lived in the apartment directly above mine. Maybe they knew something, maybe they'd heard the noises too. I needed answers, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could take the creeping fear that was slowly consuming me. When I knocked on their door, there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, my patience wearing thin. Still nothing. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, the door opened slightly. I hesitated before pushing it all the way open, unsure of what I might find. The apartment inside was empty, completely bare, no furniture, no signs of anyone ever having lived there. Just empty walls and a dusty floor. I stood there for a long time, my thoughts racing. This was impossible. How could anyone live in an apartment without leaving any trace of themselves behind? And then, in the corner of the room, something caught my eye, a small, withered notebook. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers trembling as I flipped through its pages. It was full of strange, fragmented notes, written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting. The entries didn't make sense at first. They were vague, disjointed thoughts about sounds, shadows, and things that moved in the dark. Some pages were covered in strange symbols, ones I didn't recognize. One entry caught my eye, though. It was different from the rest. The door opened again tonight. The sounds on the roof are louder now. I hear them moving. But there's something else, something that watches. Something that waits. I froze. My heart seemed to stop for a moment as the weight of the words hit me. The door. The sounds on the roof. Watching. Waiting. It was the same things I'd been hearing, the same dread that had been consuming me. The realization sent a chill down my spine. Before I could read further, I heard a sound from behind me, a light scraping, like a nail dragging across wood. It was soft, but unmistakable. My head snapped toward the door. The hallway was dark, but there was someone standing there. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It was a figure, barely visible in the dim light of the hallway. It was standing motionless, just beyond the threshold of the doorway. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, an overwhelming weight pressing in from all sides. I thought for a moment that I might have imagined it, but the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. The figure was real. It was watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, I dropped the notebook and ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing, my legs moving as fast as they could carry me, but I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. I had to escape. I rushed back to my own apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The silence of the apartment seemed to close in around me, even more suffocating than before. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the roof again. But this time, they weren't dragging. They were quick, sharp, like someone running. The door behind me creaked. I turned around, terrified. It was open again. Slowly, inch by inch, it was opening on its own, just like the first time. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was racing, but all I could focus on was the door. It was open now, wide enough for someone to step through. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft, but clear. Come closer. The words were gentle, almost coaxing, but they carried an undeniable sense of authority. They came from beyond the door, from the darkness that lay beyond. I felt my heart stop. I felt myself being pulled toward the door, my body acting without my permission. Come closer. I had to get out of there. I couldn't let whatever was on the other side of that door get any closer. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop myself from moving. My feet took one slow step forward. Another. Before I knew it, I was standing in front of the door, staring into the empty hallway beyond. The lights flickered above me, casting shadows that seemed to dance and shift as though they had a life of their own. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard a sound coming from the ceiling. It was louder now, more distinct. The scraping, dragging noise. But it was not on the roof anymore. It was inside the building. It was in the walls. And it was moving closer. I reached for the door handle, but my hand hesitated just inches from it. The door slammed shut. The room around me seemed to tremble, and I could hear the pounding in my chest, louder than any sound in the apartment. I turned to face the room again, my body frozen in place. The footsteps were right above me now, unmistakable, moving from one side of the ceiling to the other, like something pacing. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. But the door was locked. I tried the handle again. Locked. The lock had no keyhole. It was as if the door itself didn't want me to leave. Come closer, the voice whispered once more, now more urgent. You belong here now. I stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could hear the pounding of feet above, the sound of something approaching, something dark and terrible. It was waiting for me. And there was no escape. The fear was starting to consume me. It wasn't just the noise anymore, it was everything. The apartment, the building, the shadows that seemed to stretch just a little too far, the air that felt too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. I spent the night pacing, glancing constantly at the door, at the windows, at the walls. The ceiling seemed to groan, and the floorboards creak beneath my feet. It felt like the whole place was alive, shifting and stretching, trying to trap me. The sound from the roof was louder now, more insistent, more frantic. I couldn't even tell if it was above me anymore, or if it was moving through the walls, across the floor, from one limb to the next. It didn't stop. At one point, I grabbed my phone and dialed the number for emergency services, just to have a voice on the other end. I needed to hear someone. But when the line clicked, there was only silence. No ringing, no response. Just the quiet hum of the empty apartment. I hung up, heart pounding. The silence felt worse now, like it was closing in on me from all sides. And then I heard it. A sharp knock at the door. My breath hitched to my throat. I didn't know what I expected, but I certainly didn't expect this. I slowly approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear anything from the other side. But there was nothing. Just the low hum of the apartment, the sound of my own heart pounding in my chest. I opened the door just a crack. The hallway was empty. I stepped out cautiously, eyes darting from side to side, searching for any movement, any sign of life. The air in the hallway was thick, almost oppressive. The building felt more like a maze now, each hallway the same as the last, each door leading to something familiar, but still wrong. It didn't take long before I felt it again, the eyes on me. I turned around quickly. Nothing. But there was a new sound now, footsteps from behind me. Slow. Heavy. I turned again, faster this time, but there was still no one there. The hallway was empty. It had to be. I must have been imagining it. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, right behind me, always just out of view. My head spun with confusion. Where were they coming from? It was impossible. The building was supposed to be empty. But then, the noise stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse, a soft whisper. You shouldn't have come here. I spun around again, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one. The hallway was still empty. The whisper had been so clear, though. I had heard it. I backed into my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. I wasn't going to stay out there. Not with whatever was following me. But then, to my horror, the lock on the door clicked. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't moved. The door swung open by itself, as if something on the other side were gently nudging it open. Come closer. The voice again. It was soft, like a gentle breeze, but it carried with it a command that froze me in place. I stood there, unable to move, my mind a haze of panic and disbelief. I could hear the footsteps again, but this time they were inside. Slowly, they moved across the floor, right behind me. But when I turned, no one was there. No one. I felt a coldness spread over me, a chill that seeped into my bones. It wasn't just the air, it was the very walls, the space around me. They were closing in. I could feel them, pressing against me, surrounding me. The whispering continued, now louder, as though they were all speaking in unison. You shouldn't have come. The walls seemed to hum, vibrating with the voices. The ceiling trembled. The floor beneath my feet felt unstable, like it might give way at any moment. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight. I couldn't leave. There was no way out. Then, the lights flickered. And in the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. Tall, thin, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was standing at the far end of the room, just beyond the kitchen. Watching me. Waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, silent and still, as though it was measuring me, deciding what to do next. The whispers grew louder. They were all around me now, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. They were everywhere. You shouldn't have come here. You belong to us now. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped in the center of the room, staring at the figure. It took a step forward. The room was suddenly cold. Freezing cold. The figure's eyes, dark and empty, locked onto mine. I could feel them, those eyes, piercing through me, pulling me closer, pulling me into their emptiness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The door slammed shut behind me, and the apartment went dark. Then, silence. I was alone. But I wasn't. I woke up in darkness, not knowing where I was, or how long I had been lying there. My head throbbed, and my body felt heavy, as though I had been dragged somewhere. Slowly, I forced myself to sit up, my hands brushing against the cold floor. The apartment was still, eerily so, and I couldn't even hear the usual hum of the city outside. It was as if the world had ceased to exist beyond these walls. I tried to stand, but my legs were shaky. The silence pressed down on me, suffocating. The air was thick, like it was trying to hold me down, to prevent me from moving. I could feel it. I could feel the watching. I didn't look at the door. I couldn't. I didn't want to know if it was open again. If it was, I wasn't sure I could fight the urge to walk through it. The voice, the whispers, were still inside my head, echoing over and over. You belong to us now. I tried to focus on something, anything that might remind me of normalcy. The furniture was where I remembered it, though the apartment felt colder, more distant. The walls seemed to be closing in again, the shadows growing longer, stretching out across the room like reaching fingers. But then, I heard it again, the soft scraping sound from above. It was subtle at first, like nails gently dragging across wood, but it grew louder. Closer. It sounded like it was coming from the floor above, but also from the walls, the very structure of the apartment. Scrape. Scrape. Each noise sent a jolt of panic through my body. My breath came in short gasps. I knew I needed to leave, but I was trapped. I could feel it now, the heavy weight of the apartment around me. The walls seemed to pulse, like they were alive. The door, if I even tried to open it, would only lead me to more of this madness. I had nowhere to go. I walked across the room, almost without thinking, my hand resting on the wall as if for support. But when I touched it, it felt wrong. The surface was too cold, too smooth. It almost felt like there was something behind it, something that didn't belong. I pulled my hand away, stepping back. That was when I noticed it, the small crack in the corner of the wall, barely visible unless you were standing right next to it. I moved closer, inspecting it. It was narrow, no bigger than a hairline fracture, but something about it caught my attention. I knelt down, pressing my fingers to the crack, feeling the coldness seep into my skin. It felt wrong. It didn't feel like part of the apartment at all. Like the wall wasn't supposed to be there. I pushed against it. And then, with a soft, muffled click, the crack widened slightly, as if something behind it had been released. A sharp, metallic scent filled the air, and the scraping sound above me grew louder, closer. The walls were shifting. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind spinning. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. The scraping noise stopped suddenly, and in the silence that followed, a new sound filled the room, a low, deep hum, like an engine starting up. It seemed to come from everywhere, vibrating the very floor beneath my feet. The sound wasn't mechanical, though. It wasn't a machine. It was alive. I could feel it pulsing in the walls, in the ceiling, in my chest. I backed away from the wall, my breath shallow, eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. Then I heard it. A sound, soft and subtle at first, but growing louder by the second. A sound that I knew all too well. Footsteps. But not on the floor. No, these footsteps were on the ceiling. Above me. Step. 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 The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was walking above me, dragging its feet across the ceiling, making sure I could hear every movement. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand an answer, but I couldn't. The sound was too real, too close. It was all I could hear. And then the door creaked open again. I didn't look. I couldn't. But the air in the room shifted, becoming heavier, denser. It was as if something was standing right behind me, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I could feel its presence. The footsteps above me stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was suffocating, heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. I could feel it. It was waiting for me. With my heart pounding, I forced myself to move toward the door. My hands were shaking, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to escape, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out of here. I reached the door and pulled it open. The hallway was empty. There was nothing there. But the air was thick with a presence, something that filled the space and made every shadow seem alive. The door to the apartment above mine was ajar. I hadn't noticed it before. It was wide open now, as if inviting me in. The footsteps started again. This time, they weren't on the ceiling. They were coming from behind the door. I stepped forward, drawn to it, unable to stop myself. Each step I took felt like I was being pulled in. I reached for the door handle, and as my fingers touched it, the temperature in the hallway dropped. A chill ran up my spine. And then I heard it, the voice. Come closer. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was louder, clearer, and I could feel it vibrating in my bones. The voice wasn't asking me to come closer, it was telling me. I couldn't stop. My hand turned the handle, and the door creaked open. Inside, the apartment above mine was exactly the same as my own, empty. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw something that froze me in place. On the floor, scattered in a perfect circle, were hundreds of small, broken mirrors. They were shattered, their sharp edges catching the light and reflecting 1,000 images of myself, distorted, twisted, but all me. And standing in the center of the circle was the figure. The tall, thin one, its hollow eyes staring right at me, as though it had been waiting for me all along. You belong here now. The door slammed shut behind me, and the room went dark. And then I heard the footsteps again. Closer. I couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in on me, pressing against my chest. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat thumping loudly in my ears, but it didn't drown out the footsteps. Step, step, step. They were coming closer, each footfall sending a fresh wave of panic through me. I backed away from the figure standing in the center of the room. It hadn't moved. Its hollow eyes, those empty, terrifying eyes, remained fixed on me. I felt a strange pull toward it, as if it were dragging me closer, as if it was calling me. My feet refused to obey. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, to turn and escape, but my legs felt frozen, heavy, trapped in place. The whispers grew louder, clearer now. 1,000 voices, all overlapping, filling my head, drowning out everything else. You belong here. You are ours. Come closer. I couldn't tell if the whispers were coming from the figure or if they were emanating from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. It didn't matter. They were everywhere, pressing in, surrounding me, suffocating me. Then, with a sudden, jarring clarity, the figure spoke again. This time, its voice was clear and cold, like ice scraping against bone. You have always been here. I felt the floor beneath me shift, as if it was no longer solid ground, but something far more sinister, like the floorboards themselves had turned to liquid, trying to pull me in. The world around me seemed to bend and warp, stretching out of shape, becoming an impossible version of itself. The mirrors on the floor shimmered with an eerie glow, their broken edges reflecting fractured images of my own face. In one shard, I saw myself, smiling, grinning with an unsettling look in my eyes. In another, I saw my reflection, distorted, twisted, the features melted and stretched in an unnatural way. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged and shallow. The door to the apartment was still behind me, just out of reach. I needed to get to it, to escape. But the more I looked at it, the further it seemed to be. The hallway outside was growing darker, the shadows lengthening into thick pools of blackness, swallowing everything in their path. No, not again. I turned back toward the figure. Its eyes, those empty, hollow sockets, were no longer just staring, they were pulling me in, drawing me toward them like magnets, like some invisible force was yanking me forward. I felt myself take a step, and then another. I tried to resist. I tried to scream, to move away, but my body betrayed me. My feet kept moving, one step after another, until I was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by the mirrors, the shattered pieces reflecting 1,000 versions of myself. This isn't real. The thought echoed in my mind, but it didn't seem to make any difference. What was real? What had ever been real? The apartment? The figure? The whispers? Or had all of this been building, slowly, from the moment I'd stepped through that door? I didn't know anymore. The figure moved. Slowly, it lifted one long, spindly arm, pointing toward the broken mirrors. The movement was almost graceful, but there was something terrifying about it, something unnatural, like it had been practiced for centuries, and I was its next victim. Look at yourself. The voice was soft, almost like a lullaby, but it cut through the stillness of the room with a jagged edge. See what you have become. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see the reflection. But my eyes were drawn to it, as if I had no control, as if my body was no longer mine to command. I stared at the shards of glass, each one reflecting a different part of me, each piece distorting the truth, twisting it, turning it into something monstrous. The figure's voice filled the room, its words like a hypnotic chant. You are part of this place now. You always were. The floor beneath me shifted again, and suddenly I wasn't standing in the room anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere darker, colder. I could still hear the whispers, the scraping of the walls, the relentless footsteps that had followed me from the beginning. But this time, it wasn't just me. I turned, and I saw them. Hundreds of figures, standing in the shadows, all of them watching me. Their faces were just like mine. Hollow. Empty. But they weren't me. They were something else. Something that had been twisted, broken, destroyed. And they were waiting. We have always been here. The words were a chorus now, echoing around me, reverberating in my skull. I tried to scream, to shout, to break free, but my mouth wouldn't move. My body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in this place, surrounded by my own fractured self. I felt the coldness again, creeping along my skin, wrapping itself around my limbs, tightening like chains. I was bound, helpless, unable to escape. The whispers grew louder, more demanding. You belong to us now. And then, in the distance, I saw it, the door. The door to my apartment. The door that I had walked through so many times before. But this time, it wasn't open. It was closed, locked tight, sealed with chains. I reached out to it, desperate, but the closer I got, the further it seemed to move away from me. It was taunting me, keeping me just out of reach. You can never leave. And as the chains tightened around me, as the whispers swallowed me whole, I realized something: I had never really left. Not from the beginning. I had always been here. Always would be. The lights went out, and I was alone. Have you ever looked at a picture and wondered if it was really the way you remembered? What if something was off? That's what happened to us. It started out simple, almost laughable. My girlfriend, Emily, and I had just moved in together a few months ago, and we were organizing our old photographs. There was this one album we had, full of memories, some of us as kids, some of our trips together, family gatherings. Nothing too strange about it. Just regular photos, like any other. But one evening, as we were flipping through it, I noticed something strange. I pointed it out to Emily. She laughed it off at first, thinking I was just tired. There was a photo of us from last summer, a picture of the two of us sitting by a lake, grinning at the camera. But as I stared at it, something was wrong. The faces, our faces, were blurry. It wasn't like the photo had been smudged or damaged. No, it was different. The blur wasn't from a bad camera. It looked like someone had just erased the faces. Are you seeing this? I asked, my voice a little shaky. Emily leaned in, her brow furrowing as she took a closer look. What do you mean? She asked. It looks fine to me. But I knew it wasn't fine. I wasn't imagining it. The faces were gone. The space where our faces should have been was just empty. I flipped to the next page in the album, feeling uneasy. The photo was of us at a family wedding, laughing at some joke. The same thing. The faces were gone, replaced by faint, blurry outlines. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make you question if you were seeing things. I don't know, Emily, I muttered. This is weird. Emily shrugged it off, dismissing it as nothing more than a weird printing error, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It felt like something was changing, shifting, right in front of us. I could almost hear the distant hum of something moving in the background, like an engine turning on in the distance. Subtle, but there. The next day, we decided to check the video footage from the cameras we'd set up around our apartment. It was routine. We had a couple of security cameras installed for peace of mind, nothing too fancy. I thought maybe I had missed something the night before, that I was just seeing things in the photos. We sat on the couch, scrolling through the footage on the laptop. We watched the first few hours, nothing of interest. But then, I saw something in the footage that made my heart skip a beat. It was from the night before, just after we finished looking through the album. Emily had been in the kitchen, and I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone. The camera in the living room had captured everything clearly, or at least, that's what I thought. The footage was normal at first, until the moment I got up from the couch. I had turned towards the bookshelf, and as I did, the camera caught something, or someone. In the background, just by the hallway, the outline of a figure appeared. At first, it was just a shadow, a shift in the dim light, but then it solidified. The figure moved, stepped forward, then vanished from view. It didn't make sense. I rewound the footage, played it back. But there was nothing there, just the same fleeting shadow, disappearing without a trace. I could hear my own voice in the recording, clear as day, asking Emily if she'd seen it too. "You're imagining things," Emily said, her voice more dismissive this time. "It's probably just the way the light is, or a glitch in the camera." But I didn't believe her. That feeling from earlier, the unease, the hum, was growing stronger. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange noises, soft thuds, almost like footsteps, coming from the walls. But when I looked, there was nothing there. No one. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the house settling, but the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. I woke up in the middle of the night, sweat on my brow, the room feeling too warm, too suffocating. I glanced over at Emily, lying beside me, her face peaceful in sleep. But as I looked at her, I realized something. Her face was wrong. It was blurry, like in the photographs. Faint, as though it was melting out of the frame. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but the second my fingers brushed against her skin, the blurry face faded. Gone. The room went still. I could hear my breath, shallow and fast, but nothing else. Emily stirred slightly, and I saw her face snap back into place, like nothing had happened. I turned away, eyes wide, my body frozen. I knew I wasn't imagining things. Something was happening. Something I couldn't understand. The faces weren't just disappearing in the photos anymore. They were disappearing in real life. And they weren't just fading. They were leaving the frame altogether. I lay there for hours, unable to sleep, trying to figure out what to do, how to fix it. But the question kept echoing in my mind. What happens when the frame is empty? The next day, I told myself I had to shake it off. Emily was still convinced I was just overthinking things. She had no idea what I'd seen or what I'd felt during the night. We spent the morning walking around the apartment, doing the usual things, making breakfast, drinking coffee, sorting through more boxes. But the air felt heavier now. The space felt different, like it was slowly changing around me. By the time we finished unpacking, my nerves were shot. I had to know if it was just me or if there was something wrong with the place. I started searching through old photos online, reading through old news stories about the building, trying to find some explanation. But nothing stood out. The building had been here for years. Nothing strange. Just a regular old apartment complex. It was only when I checked the local forums that something caught my eye. One post was from a couple of months ago. The poster mentioned something strange happening in one of the apartments. They didn't go into much detail, but they mentioned that the photos they'd taken had started to change. Faces disappearing. Same thing that had been happening to us. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. It wasn't just an isolated incident. More people had experienced the same thing, living in different parts of the building. All of them reported the same phenomenon: blurry faces, empty frames, and strange shadows in the corners of their photos and videos. I showed Emily the post, but she only raised an eyebrow. People will believe anything, she said, dismissing it as coincidence. But I could see the worry in her eyes. Even she was starting to feel it, though she wouldn't admit it. That night, I decided to do something I should have done earlier. I checked the camera footage again. It was late, maybe around 2 in the morning. Emily had gone to bed earlier, exhausted from the day. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the computer screen. I scrolled through the footage from the past few days, looking for something, anything, that could explain what was going on. The more I watched, the worse it got. It was subtle at first, but then I started seeing the same thing from before. The figures, the shadows, the sudden disappearances. There was one video where the figure, no, the shape, came into view just as I was about to sit down. It was tall, thin, its outline flickering like it wasn't quite part of the real world. The camera had caught it as I walked into the frame. I'd been standing by the window, and I could see my reflection in the glass. The figure wasn't in the reflection, though. It was standing behind me, but its face was distorted, blurry, like it was being sucked out of the frame. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the laptop screen flickered. The video paused, then skipped ahead. I clicked to rewind it, but the footage wouldn't respond. The video kept jumping to moments where nothing was happening. I hit the keyboard harder, frustration growing, until finally, the screen went black. The room went quiet. The hum that had been in the background, the one I had been hearing since the night before, stopped. Everything was still. Then, a soft click. It was the door. The front door was opening slowly. Just a crack at first, and then wider. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. It was as if I had no control over my body. I couldn't move. I slowly crept towards the door, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. The door wasn't supposed to open. We locked it before bed, I was sure of it. I reached out, my hand trembling, and grasped the doorknob. It was cold, unnaturally cold. I hesitated before pulling it open all the way. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just the dim glow of the building's emergency lights flickering down the hall. But there was something off about the space now. It wasn't just empty. It was wrong. I stepped out into the hall. The quiet was deafening. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. And then I heard it. A soft rustling, like the shuffle of feet. It was coming from the far end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I turned in the direction of the sound, my eyes searching for any movement. Nothing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting. The rustling had stopped. But then I heard something else, a faint click, like a camera shutter. I turned toward the sound. My eyes widened as I saw it. The picture on the wall. The photo that had hung there for years. It was an old photograph, one of the first ones taken after the building was built, showing the original tenants standing proudly in front of the building. Their faces were faded, but still visible. Now, though, the faces were gone. Completely. The photo had changed, just like the ones in our album. And that's when I realized the truth. This wasn't just about the photographs. This wasn't just about faces disappearing or blurry images. It was the entire building. It was erasing us. One piece at a time. The faces, the memories, the very presence of who we were, it was all being taken. I backed away from the photo, feeling my breath catch in my throat. It was clear now. The building didn't just want us to forget it. It wanted us to disappear entirely. And I was starting to wonder how much longer I had before it took everything. I couldn't sleep that night. The sounds, the images, the feeling of something creeping in the corners of the apartment, it all seemed to merge into one, like I was caught in a dream I couldn't wake up from. The door had stayed open. I hadn't closed it, too afraid to take my eyes off the hallway. The emptiness in the apartment felt heavier now, as if the very walls were pressing in on me, smothering the air, leaving only a strange buzzing sound that filled the silence. Emily had slept through everything, as usual. I wanted to shake her awake, to tell her what was happening, but deep down, I was afraid. Afraid that once I spoke it out loud, it would become real. The kind of real you couldn't escape, no matter how hard you tried. The next morning, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the street below. Everything looked normal, but I knew better than to trust what seemed normal anymore. What was real anymore? Emily woke up just as the first rays of light began to filter through the blinds. She stretched and walked over to me, smiling as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. I could see it in her eyes, even if she wouldn't admit it. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked her, my voice tight. She shook her head. "I didn't hear anything. You're probably just imagining things." I wanted to argue, to tell her that I wasn't imagining it. But the moment I spoke those words, a chill crept over me. What if we're already being erased? I asked quietly, more to myself than to her. Emily looked at me, her expression blank for a moment. "What do you mean by that?" I stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. My thoughts were racing, everything blending together into one tangled mess of dread. "I don't know," I admitted, running my hands through my hair. "But the pictures, the video footage, everything's changing. It's like we're fading out of existence, one frame at a time." She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she just walked to the kitchen, making herself breakfast, as if we weren't talking about disappearing from reality itself. I watched her, feeling disconnected, as though we were living in two different worlds now. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the video footage from the previous night again. Maybe there was something I missed, something that could explain all of this. But as I rewound it and played it back, I couldn't help but feel my stomach drop. The footage was distorted. There were parts where the video seemed to jump, the frames warping in a way I hadn't seen before. The room, the hallway, everything was blurring in and out, like the video was struggling to hold on to reality itself. The edges of the room started to darken, the shadows stretching further, consuming the walls, the furniture. I felt nauseous as I watched the footage, the quiet clicking sound of the frames growing louder in my ears. It was happening again. Just like the photos, our faces weren't in the frame. I tried to pause it, but the video wouldn't stop. It played faster, jumping from moment to moment, showing images of us sitting on the couch, laughing, talking, but with no faces, no details. Just vague outlines of our figures. The longer I watched, the more everything around us started to fade, like the apartment was erasing us from the memory of the camera, piece by piece. Emily stepped into the room just as the screen flashed white and went black. "What's going on?" she asked, looking at the laptop with concern. I couldn't answer her. I didn't have the words. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to explain. She was still too grounded in reality to understand what was happening, and I feared that if I said it out loud, I would lose her too. I turned off the laptop and stood up, pacing the apartment. The space felt suffocating. I needed to get out. I needed to see if anyone else knew what was happening. "Let's go for a walk," I said suddenly. "I need to get out of here." Emily didn't hesitate. She nodded and followed me. But even as we walked through the city streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was like something was moving just behind my eyes, something that was aware of me, of us, but didn't want us to know it was there. The more I tried to ignore it, the more I realized it was inescapable. When we returned, the apartment felt colder than before. Emily went straight to the kitchen to make dinner, but I couldn't bring myself to join her. I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker outside, feeling the strange emptiness pressing in on me. Then it happened again. The front door opened on its own. I walked over to it slowly, my heart pounding, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop myself. The door swung open wide, and once again, the hallway was empty. But something was different. Something was watching. I could feel it. From the corner of my eye, I saw the shadows shift. A figure, but this time it wasn't just a shape. It had form. It was tall and thin, with sharp, indistinct features. It seemed to hover just outside the frame of the doorway, as if it were waiting for permission to enter. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure stepped forward, one slow, deliberate movement after another. I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't just a shadow. This wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something else, something that had no business being here. As it moved closer, I felt a tightness in my chest, a pressure that seemed to grow with every passing second. The figure reached the doorway and stopped, staring at me. And I saw it clearly for the first time. It had no face. Just like in the photos. It was empty. And in that moment, I realized the apartment wasn't just erasing faces. It was erasing us. And I was next. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest like it was trying to escape. The figure stood there, just beyond the doorway, motionless but somehow alive. Its presence seemed to stretch, pressing against the very walls of the apartment, making the space feel smaller and more suffocating. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. I could only stare at the empty space where its face should have been, where nothing existed but darkness. It was real. It was here. The sound of Emily's footsteps broke the silence behind me, a small comfort, but it was too late. She walked up to me, her voice soft and distant. "What's wrong?" she asked, but she didn't sound like herself. Her voice was hollow, like it had been stretched too thin. I turned to look at her, expecting to see the woman I loved, but something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. There was a dullness in her eyes, as if she wasn't quite here. I reached for her, trying to shake her back to reality, but when my hand touched her, the sensation was off, too cold, like she wasn't even real. Before I could say anything, I turned back toward the door. The figure was gone. I stepped out into the hallway, my heart thudding in my ears. The air felt heavier here, the walls pressing in, the silence too deep. The hallway stretched endlessly, a faint echo of my footsteps the only sound, but that buzzing feeling, the feeling that something was wrong, intensified with every step. I reached the end of the hallway and paused, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. I looked back, expecting to see Emily behind me, but the door to our apartment was shut. I opened it. She wasn't there. The apartment was empty. I ran into the living room, my eyes searching for her. I called her name, but my voice seemed to dissolve in the air. The apartment had never felt so hollow before. The silence was crushing. There were no sounds, no movement, just a stillness that felt unnatural. I rushed to the bedroom, calling out again. "Emily!" My voice cracked as I spoke, the panic rising in my chest. No response. I checked every room, my mind racing, my thoughts swirling. Where was she? What happened? I couldn't even remember when she had disappeared, and the memory felt like it was slipping away with every second that passed. I went back to the living room, my eyes falling on the TV. The screen was on, but there was no image. The picture had turned to static, flickering in the dim light. I approached it cautiously, reaching out to turn it off, but then something caught my eye. A shape moving in the static. It was fleeting at first, just a shadow in the static noise, but then it began to take form. A face. It wasn't Emily's. It was mine. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. My face was slowly fading, just like the photographs. The image flickered, and I could see myself, but the details were starting to blur. My eyes, my nose, my mouth, all seemed to disappear, the features vanishing like they were being erased by an invisible hand. I grabbed the remote and switched off the TV, but it didn't help. The image was still there, lingering in my mind. It was as if my own reflection had turned against me, retreating into nothingness. The buzzing sound, the strange vibration I'd felt earlier, was louder now, shaking the very foundation of the apartment. The walls seemed to bend inward, warping with the noise, and I could feel the air thinning. The apartment wasn't just erasing the faces. It was erasing us. The more I stood still, the more I felt myself slipping away, like I was becoming part of the emptiness, disappearing bit by bit. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my vision swimming. I needed to leave. I needed to get out before I too was erased from existence. But as I reached for the door, I saw it again, the shadow, standing at the edge of the room, watching me. It was no longer just a shadow. It had formed now, clear and defined. The tall, thin figure from before had returned, and this time I could see it fully. The empty face. The dark, hollow eyes. It was moving toward me, slow but inevitable. I backed away, feeling the cold crawl over my skin. There was nowhere to run. The figure's movements were deliberate, calculated, like it knew exactly where I would go. I was trapped. And then, as if something snapped in the air, the world around me shifted. The apartment was no longer the familiar place I had lived in. The walls were darker, the air thicker. The figure was closer now, towering over me, its shape still empty, still hollow. It reached out toward me, and I froze. It spoke, but not in words. It was more of a feeling, a thought that pressed into my mind. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, in the corners of my brain, a voice I couldn't hear but could feel. "You're fading," it whispered, the words not coming from its mouth, but from everywhere around me, sinking into my very being. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my voice was gone. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My hands, my body, were becoming nothing more than outlines, fading into the shadows. The figure reached forward, and I felt my consciousness slip away. My body felt lighter, as if it were being pulled from the room, pulled into a place where nothing existed, where I would never exist again. And in that final moment, I understood. I wasn't just being erased from the photo albums. I wasn't just disappearing from the video footage. I was being erased from the very fabric of reality. And as everything around me turned black, I realized the worst part. I was never really here at all. The apartment was never mine. I was never supposed to exist in the first place. I woke up in darkness. It wasn't like any normal sleep. It wasn't like I had fallen unconscious. It was as if I had simply ceased to be, only to suddenly reappear without warning. There was no feeling of transition, no gradual return to consciousness. One moment, there was nothing, and the next, I was somewhere. I sat up slowly, blinking, trying to adjust my eyes. The space around me was thick with an unsettling quiet. There was no hum of the refrigerator, no distant traffic sounds, no footsteps from the hallway, just a complete absence of sound. The air felt wrong. It was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I looked around. The apartment was the same, but different. The walls, once familiar, now seemed more distant, as if the room had stretched beyond the limits of what I remembered. Everything felt off. The colors were muted, the shapes not quite aligning with my sense of space. I stood up, my legs shaky, as if I had been lying for too long. My thoughts were still clouded, like something was blocking my mind from fully functioning. It felt as if I was trying to remember something that was just out of reach, something important, but I couldn't grasp it. I moved toward the door, but it wasn't the same door I remembered. The knob was slightly crooked, the wood darker and worn, as though it had aged in a way that didn't make sense. I hesitated, my hand hovering above the handle, unsure of whether to open it. But I had no choice. Something told me that I needed to leave this place. I needed to find out what had happened, what was happening to me, to this apartment. I turned the handle and stepped outside. The hallway was different. The floorboards creaked under my feet, but the sound was far too loud, as if amplified by the silence around me. The walls stretched impossibly far, the distance between rooms suddenly too great. Every corner was darker, the shadows deeper. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing with a sense of foreboding. The air felt colder now, like it was pressing in from all sides. As I passed each door, I couldn't help but glance at them, half expecting to see something watching me from behind. But there was nothing. Just empty spaces. I reached the end of the hall, and my eyes locked on the apartment door. My apartment. But when I stepped closer, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The door was different. It was too clean, too new, with no sign of wear or age. It was as if it had never been opened before. I reached for the handle, hesitating. My hand trembled as it closed around the knob, but then I turned it. The door creaked open. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The apartment was empty. Not in the way it had been before, where things were misplaced or things didn't feel quite right. No, this was empty in a far more profound way. The air was still, the space hollow. And then I saw it. The photo album. It was lying open on the table, the pages turned to the very last photo I had ever taken. But when I looked at it, I froze. There were no faces. No Emily. No me. Just the background, the setting, the room. Everything was there, everything except for us. The photos had taken the faces, just like the others. But something was different. The room around me seemed to pulse with an eerie, unnatural vibration. The photo began to flicker, just like the TV screen from before, only this time it didn't fade, it shifted. The faces didn't vanish, they twisted out of the frame, slowly. They were being pulled away by something unseen. It was as if the photo was being erased from the inside out, like the figures were slowly being sucked into the space behind the image until there was nothing left but blank paper. I stumbled backward, eyes wide with horror. The room seemed to stretch, the walls bending outward. The shadows grew deeper, more solid, as if they were about to swallow me whole. And then, from the corner of the room, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." It was a voice I didn't recognize, but somehow it was familiar. It was hollow, like the one I had heard before, that same voice that seemed to come from the darkness, from everywhere and nowhere. I looked around frantically, but there was no one there. Nothing but the empty space of the apartment. But I could feel it. Something was in the room with me, something that shouldn't have been. I could feel my body trembling, my heart racing, but I had no choice. I had to leave. I ran to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I felt it again, the weight of the emptiness, the cold, suffocating feeling. The door wouldn't open. I pulled and pulled, but it was stuck, frozen in place as if it had fused with the walls. Then I heard it again. The voice, only closer this time. "You don't belong here." My breath caught in my throat as I turned, my eyes scanning the room. There, at the edge of my vision, I saw it. The shadow. It had no shape, no form, but it was there, looming, waiting. Slowly, it began to stretch toward me, growing larger with every passing second. I could feel it wrapping around me, suffocating me, until I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then, just as I thought I would lose myself completely, everything went black. I woke up again, but this time, I wasn't in the apartment. I was nowhere. There was no light. No sound. Only a deep, endless void. And I realized then, nothing would ever bring me back. I had vanished, just like the faces, just like the apartment. I had become nothing. And I knew, in that moment, the truth. This was never my reality to begin with. Have you ever seen something that wasn't supposed to exist? I ask myself that question every night now. But I didn't understand what it meant when I first noticed it, while I was driving through the countryside on an empty road late one evening. It had been a long day. No matter how far I traveled, the destination always seemed to be just beyond my reach. I was already tired, but something inside me pushed me forward, told me to keep driving. The sky was overcast, dark clouds hanging low, and the headlights of my car barely pierced through the gloom. The road was narrow, twisting, and winding, with no sign of life for miles. Just trees, fields, and the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse, its light barely visible through the heavy mist that seemed to settle everywhere. I was beginning to wonder if I had taken the wrong turn when I saw it. At first, it looked like any other bridge, nothing unusual. But then I realized something was off. The bridge wasn't marked on my map, nor did it appear on the GPS. I slowed down, trying to get a better look, but there was nothing on the screen, just a blank spot in the middle of the road. I even checked the road signs, but they were faded and almost illegible, like they hadn't been maintained for years. My curiosity piqued. I decided to cross it. I had been driving for hours, and I knew I couldn't just turn back. The bridge was old, its wooden planks creaking under the weight of the car, and the railing was barely holding on. But it seemed stable enough. As I drove across, the mist seemed to grow thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence outside felt unnatural. There was no breeze, no sounds of animals, no distant hum of traffic. Just an eerie stillness. I reached the other side of the bridge, and the feeling of unease grew. There was something about the air. It felt different, heavier, as if I had just crossed a threshold into another world. The road ahead looked strange. The landscape was too quiet, too calm. The trees lining the road stood unnaturally still, their leaves frozen in time, as if waiting for something. I tried to pull out my phone, but there was no signal. My GPS screen remained blank, just like it had been before I crossed. My car was the only thing moving in a world that felt completely still. I could see the town in the distance, the lights of buildings just beyond the horizon, but there was something unsettling about the way they shimmered in the mist. It wasn't the soft, familiar glow of streetlights. It was sharper, colder, almost as if the town wasn't real. I drove on, hoping to find a place to stop, maybe a gas station or a diner. But the town remained elusive. The farther I drove, the more the road seemed to stretch in ways I couldn't quite understand. The lights ahead never seemed to get any closer, and the trees on either side grew thicker, taller, their trunks like black columns that seemed to close in on me. It felt like I was being led deeper into something, a place that didn't belong in the world I knew. The kind of place you only hear about in stories, places where time stretches, where reality bends, where the rules don't make sense anymore. And then, I saw it. The first sign of life since I crossed the bridge. A streetlight flickered on in the distance, casting a dim, yellow glow over the road ahead. I thought I could make out the outline of a figure beneath it. Someone was standing there, waiting. I approached cautiously, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. As I got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned coat, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge the car, just stood perfectly still, as if frozen in time. I stopped the car, not sure if I should approach. Something about him made my stomach turn, but I couldn't quite explain why. I glanced at the GPS again, still nothing. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The bridge, the town, everything was gone. The road stretched out behind me, empty, like it had never existed in the first place. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward the road. And as he did, something changed in the air around me. The silence, which had been pressing down on me since I crossed the bridge, grew heavier, more oppressive. I didn't know why I did it, but I pressed the gas pedal and drove past him. I didn't even look back. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, I would see something that I couldn't unsee. I pushed the car faster, the engine humming beneath me, my breath shallow and erratic. The road seemed to stretch further, the darkness closing in like a wall. The town remained just out of reach, its lights still shimmering ahead but not getting any closer. Suddenly, the road curved sharply. I didn't have time to react before the car's tires hit the gravel, sending me into a spin. I tried to regain control, but it was too late. The car slid, crashing into the thick blackness of the trees. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the flickering lights of the town, still too far to reach, but now just within my grasp. And in the quiet, as the world around me shifted, I heard it. A voice. A soft whisper in the darkness. "You've crossed the bridge." I woke up with a start, the harsh smell of gasoline and wet leaves filling my senses. The car had come to a halt, its front end buried in the thick underbrush at the edge of the road. For a moment, I just sat there, disoriented, unsure of how long I had been unconscious. The silence around me was deafening. The world outside was darker than it had been earlier, and I felt as though I was no longer in control of my own surroundings. I pulled myself together and quickly checked the car for damage. My hands were trembling, but everything seemed to be intact, no broken glass, no immediate signs of injury. The vehicle had stopped just inches from a massive tree trunk. I let out a shaky breath of relief. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold, damp air. The night was thick with mist, so dense it was almost impossible to see beyond a few feet. The road behind me had disappeared completely, swallowed by the darkness. There was no sign of the bridge, no indication of how I'd gotten here. The town I had seen before? Gone. The lights that had seemed so close were now just a distant memory. I had no idea where I was, and the fact that I couldn't even retrace my steps left me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. The only direction left to go was forward, and so I began walking down the road, my shoes crunching against the gravel. Each step felt like it was taking me deeper into a place that wasn't quite right. The further I walked, the less I felt like I was still on Earth. The air felt off. It wasn't just the mist, it was the weight of the atmosphere, something that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The road, too, seemed to warp as I walked. The trees that flanked it didn't look like trees I knew, thick trunks, but with gnarled branches that curled toward the sky like hands reaching for something or someone. I shivered, but I kept walking. After a few minutes, I saw something. No, someone, a figure standing at the side of the road, almost hidden by the mist. This time, it was a woman, her figure barely visible against the fog. She was dressed in an old-fashioned, dark dress, her long hair hanging loose, covering part of her face. I stopped, unsure of what to do. The figure did not move, just stood there in the shadows. I wanted to call out, but the words caught in my throat. Something told me that speaking would break the fragile silence that had enveloped me, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. The woman stepped forward slowly, and as she did, I could see her face more clearly. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and a pale shade of blue that seemed to glow in the dark. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, I could hear her voice inside my head. "You're lost, aren't you?" The words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't answer. I stood frozen, unsure if I should speak or run. Her gaze never wavered, and the longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I felt. "You shouldn't have crossed the bridge," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Now, you're one of us." I couldn't move, couldn't respond. I was trapped in that moment, unable to comprehend what she meant. One of us? I barely understood what was happening, but I could feel the weight of her words pressing against my mind. Before I could react, the woman turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist as if she had never been there at all. I was left standing on the side of the road, shaking. My thoughts were a mess, lost in confusion, disbelief, and fear. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay. But the road ahead seemed endless. I checked my phone again, but there was still no signal. No GPS. I tried to remember the directions I'd been following before, but they all felt irrelevant now, like I was in a place that didn't obey the same rules as the world I knew. I walked for what felt like hours, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. Where was I? What had happened to the town? And why did it feel like the world was slipping away from me, like I was walking deeper into a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up? Then, I saw it again. The flickering light in the distance. I hurried toward it, my heart pounding. It had to be a sign. There was no way I was going to let the town slip through my fingers. This time, the light didn't shimmer. It burned brightly, solidly, as if it was meant to guide me. When I reached the source of the light, I found myself standing in front of an old-fashioned street lamp, casting an eerie glow over the ground around it. Beneath the light stood a sign, rusted and worn, barely legible. It was all I could do to make out the words. Welcome to Hollowbrook. I didn't know what to think. My heart sank as I read the sign. I had never heard of Hollowbrook. There was no town by that name on any map. I tried to take a step forward, but something stopped me. A voice, this time, louder than before, and coming from nowhere, whispered in my ear. You shouldn't have crossed the bridge. I froze. The chill in the air deepened, and a feeling of dread washed over me. It was as if the town itself was alive, watching, waiting for me to make my next move. But the only thing I could do now was move forward, deeper into Hollowbrook, and hope that somehow I could find my way out. The moment I stepped into Hollowbrook, I could feel something change in the air, like the temperature dropped just a few degrees. The fog was thicker here, almost like a living thing, curling and twisting between the streets, obscuring the town even further. Every building, every house, seemed to blur at the edges, as though they were part of a painting that was never quite finished. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. I walked further into the town, my steps muffled by the damp ground beneath me. The houses were eerily quiet, no sound of life, no dogs barking, no lights shining from windows. There were no signs of movement. It was as if I had entered a place where time had stopped. I looked up at the street signs, but none of the names matched anything I had seen before. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It was a sensation I couldn't explain, a sense of being observed from the shadows, from the places I couldn't see. I quickened my pace, hoping to find some sign of life, anything that could reassure me that I wasn't completely alone in this strange town. The further I walked, the more distorted the surroundings became. The buildings, once plain and worn, began to take on an unnatural quality, as though they were shifting, stretching toward me. Some of the houses had windows with no glass, just dark, hollow spaces where eyes should have been. Others had doors that were half open, as though waiting for someone to enter. Then, I heard something. A soft sound at first, like a whisper in the wind. I stopped and looked around, but saw no one. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The whisper came again, this time clearer. You're not supposed to be here. It was a voice, a woman's voice, and it sent a cold shiver down my spine. I spun around, but there was nothing, just empty streets and buildings that seemed to close in on me. The whisper came again, this time from somewhere deeper within the fog. My body tensed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I had to find someone. I had to understand what was happening. I followed the voice, even though every instinct told me to turn back. The fog grew thicker the farther I went, wrapping itself around me like a blanket. I barely saw anything ahead of me, the darkness swallowing the light of the street lamps. I stumbled forward, my pulse quickening with each step. And then, through the fog, I saw a figure. A person, standing motionless in the distance. I hesitated, unsure whether to approach. But the whisper seemed to draw me in, urging me forward. I called out, "Hello?" My voice felt foreign in the heavy silence. The figure didn't move. I called again, louder this time. There was no response, no indication that the person even heard me. I walked toward them slowly, my steps growing more cautious with each movement. While I was just a few feet away, the figure finally turned. It was a man, his face pale and blank, his eyes wide, unblinking. He stared at me with a strange intensity, his lips curled into a faint, unreadable smile. I froze, caught in the gaze of this man who didn't seem quite right. His smile twisted into something darker, something unsettling. "You shouldn't have crossed the bridge," he whispered, his voice low and raspy. "Now you're one of us." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. What did he mean by that? Who were these people? Before I could ask, the man turned, his feet moving as though guided by an invisible force. He glided down the street without making a sound, vanishing into the fog as if he had never been there. I was left standing, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The eerie smile, the unsettling words, it all felt like something I couldn't escape, something that was closing in on me. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but the town was different now. The streets that had once seemed familiar were now unfamiliar. I couldn't remember how to get back to the bridge, and the signs were no help. Everything felt like it had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. In a moment of panic, I pulled out my phone again, but once again, there was no signal. I felt the weight of isolation pressing down on me, the realization that I might be stuck here. Stuck in a town that wasn't even supposed to exist. A noise interrupted my thoughts. It was a faint sound, a shuffle of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the street was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I took off down the street, my footsteps quick and uneven against the cobblestone. But no matter how fast I ran, the town seemed to stretch farther, pulling me deeper into its twisted heart. With each passing moment, I felt more certain that this place, this Hollowbrook, wasn't just strange, it was alive, and it didn't want me to leave. And in the distance, I could see the faint outline of the bridge again. But this time, it looked different. It looked wrong. And I knew then that crossing it had been the worst mistake I could have made. The bridge loomed ahead, its outline barely visible through the dense fog. It was the same bridge I had crossed earlier, at least, I thought it was. But now, it seemed different. The structure appeared warped, the iron arches twisting unnaturally, like something out of a nightmare. The fog around it thickened, swirling as though trying to keep me away, or perhaps trying to trap me inside. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet heavy, as if the earth beneath me was pulling me back. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my body betrayed me. I couldn't stop. The town behind me seemed to grow quieter, the unsettling feeling of being watched intensifying. The bridge's surface was cracked, with deep gashes running across the pavement like it had been abandoned for years. And yet, it wasn't decayed, it wasn't weathered, it looked preserved, as though it was caught in time. Just like the town itself. I stepped onto the bridge, the wood beneath my feet creaking ominously. The sound echoed through the mist, a hollow noise that seemed to carry no weight. It was as if the bridge was trying to remind me of its presence, of its reality. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air was colder now. My breath misted in front of me, even though it shouldn't have been this cold. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and walked further, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. And then I heard it. A soft sound at first, just a rustling, almost like a breeze. But it wasn't the wind. The sound grew louder, sharper, and suddenly I realized what it was: footsteps. They were coming toward me, slow and deliberate, though I couldn't see anyone through the mist. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The footsteps were unmistakable, but they didn't belong to anyone I could see. They were getting closer, their rhythm too perfect, too calculated, as though they were following me. I spun around, looking desperately for the source, but the fog was thick, blinding, and there was no sign of anyone. Yet the footsteps kept getting closer, their sound now deafening in the oppressive silence. I began to run, my legs burning as I forced myself forward. I didn't know if it was a person, a shadow, or something else entirely. But I knew I couldn't stay there. Not in this place. Not with whatever was chasing me. I reached the middle of the bridge, and for a split second, the fog parted just enough for me to glimpse something. A figure. Standing at the far end of the bridge. It was too far to make out clearly, but I could feel its presence, an overwhelming, oppressive force. The figure stood still, unmoving, as if waiting. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure didn't take a step toward me, but its presence felt like 1,000 hands reaching out to grab me. Suddenly, the footsteps behind me stopped. The silence returned, but it was even worse now. The heavy, suffocating silence of something waiting, something knowing. I couldn't see the figure anymore. It was as though it had disappeared into the fog, or worse, had never existed in the first place. I turned back to face the town, hoping to escape, but the bridge behind me was no longer the same. It had changed. The end of the bridge, which I had just seen clearly moments ago, was now shrouded in darkness. It was as though the bridge was endless, stretching on and on without an end. The way forward, the way I had just come, no longer seemed possible. I felt a cold, crawling sensation at the back of my neck. Then I saw it. A shadow slithering across the bridge. It moved quickly, not like a person, but like something far more sinister, something that was not supposed to be there. The shadow grew longer, stretching toward me, reaching for me. I turned to run, but my legs felt like lead, my body unwilling to move. It was as though the bridge itself was holding me in place. The shadow was closer now, swirling around me. I could feel its cold touch brushing against my skin, a chilling sensation that made my blood run cold. The air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, and I could barely breathe. Panic surged through me, and I forced myself to take a step, then another. But the shadow followed. No matter where I went, no matter how fast I ran, it never left. It clung to me, wrapping around me like a vice, dragging me deeper into the fog. The sound of footsteps returned, only this time they were no longer behind me. They were in front of me, coming from the direction of the figure. But they didn't sound like footsteps anymore. They were heavy, slow, deliberate. The figure had started moving. I ran faster, my heart racing, my chest tight with fear. The mist was closing in again, blurring my vision, making it harder to see. The shadow on the bridge twisted and pulsed, its form shifting, growing larger, its presence overpowering. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The bridge stretched on forever, the end disappearing into nothingness. I looked back, and there it was, the figure was moving toward me. But now, I could see its face. It wasn't human. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale surface where a face should have been. The figure wasn't walking, it was gliding, floating over the bridge, its body distorting as it came closer. And then, just as I reached the edge of the bridge, everything went silent. The figure stopped. I stood there, frozen, staring at it. It was as if time had stopped, as if the very world around me had paused. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I couldn't even scream. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and twisted, the skin stretched tight over its bones. It pointed toward the town, the shadow behind me growing larger still. It wasn't a question. It was a command. Stay. And I did. The moment the figure's command reached me, the world shifted. The air around me grew thicker, colder, and the silence became unbearable. I could feel the weight of its presence pressing on me from all directions. The hand it extended wasn't just pointing, it was beckoning, pulling me in, urging me to follow its command. I didn't move. I couldn't. The bridge felt like it was pulling me back toward the town, toward the shadows that had surrounded me from the start. I glanced over my shoulder, where the darkness seemed to stretch on infinitely, a void that swallowed any trace of light. The figure's silent command weighed heavily on me, but there was something else now, an understanding, or perhaps a terrible realization. The town, the bridge, the fog, everything had changed. The world I had known was slipping away, and in its place, something new was emerging, something twisted and wrong. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, trying to think. But the pressure in the air grew heavier, suffocating. My chest tightened, my mind racing. I had to move. I had to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The bridge was the only way forward, and yet it no longer felt like a bridge at all. It was a prison, an endless stretch of pavement leading nowhere, with no escape, no exit, just a path that wound back on itself. I heard the footsteps again, this time slower, deliberate. They weren't coming from behind me anymore, they were in front, from the direction of the figure. The sound grew louder, and I realized there was no one walking. The footsteps weren't footsteps at all. They were something else, something deeper, more unsettling. Like the earth itself was shifting beneath my feet. I looked back at the figure. Its face, still smooth and featureless, was now closer than ever. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The closer it came, the more the shadows around me seemed to bend, to merge. Its hand reached out once again, and I could feel its pull, as if my body was no longer my own. The figure didn't speak, but its presence spoke louder than words. It was as though the very fabric of reality was warping under its command. Time stretched, twisted, and I could feel myself being drawn into the void, towards whatever strange place this was, where nothing made sense. I turned away from the figure, forcing myself to move. My legs trembled beneath me, but I fought the urge to stop. I could feel the weight of the figure's gaze on my back, but I refused to look back again. I had to keep going, even though the bridge seemed endless, even though the fog thickened with every step I took. But no matter how far I ran, the end of the bridge never came. The horizon remained as distant as ever, the town fading into a blur behind me, swallowed by the thickening fog. And then, the whisper. It was barely audible, like a breath on the back of my neck. I froze, the coldness creeping up my spine. I knew, instinctively, that it was the figure. The whisper didn't belong to any human voice. It was something older, something that had been there long before me, long before the town, long before this bridge. Stay. I turned sharply, my heart racing. But the figure was gone. The fog had thickened so much that I couldn't even see the faintest outline of it. And yet, I could still feel its presence, like a shadow hovering over me, watching, waiting. The bridge stretched on, the town now completely absent from sight. The only sound was my own breathing, sharp and shallow, as I struggled to stay calm. But with every step, the fog grew denser, the path more uncertain. Suddenly, there was a light in the distance, a small flicker, like a candle burning in the dark. I squinted, desperate for some kind of direction, some sign that I wasn't lost forever. I ran towards the light, my heart pounding in my chest, hoping, praying that it was something real. The light grew larger, and I began to hear voices, soft, unintelligible murmurs, like whispers carried on the wind. But as I drew closer, the light flickered out, and the whispers fell silent. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. The town was back. But it wasn't the town I had left. It was wrong. The streets were twisted, the buildings askew, like they had been rearranged in a way that defied all logic. The houses were upside down, their windows reflecting a sky that wasn't there. The trees were bent, their branches curling in unnatural shapes. There was no one in the streets, no sounds, no movement. I stood there, paralyzed, trying to make sense of it. Was this another part of the town? Or had I somehow returned to the beginning? The place I had crossed from? I couldn't tell. I couldn't understand anything anymore. The bridge was gone. The path I had followed had vanished, replaced by this distorted, empty town. And then, a voice. A familiar voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, sharp, and cold. Welcome home. I turned, but there was no one there. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The town had swallowed me whole, and it wasn't going to let me go. Everything had changed, and I had no way of knowing how or why. But the one thing I did know was this: I was trapped. Forever. Have you ever heard your own voice when you weren't speaking? It sounds like an absurd question, doesn't it? A question that implies something strange, something out of place. But that's exactly what happened to me. I can't explain it. It's something I've been trying to make sense of for days now, and the more I think about it, the more I realize I'll never understand it. It started simply enough. I was at home, sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone after a long, tiring day. I wasn't expecting anything, but then the phone rang. The screen showed Mark's name. My best friend since college. He'd been calling me often lately, and I hadn't been in the mood for conversation. But that night, something told me I should pick up. Hello? I said, my voice flat, just a little tired. But instead of hearing Mark's familiar tone on the other end of the line, something else happened. Hello, the voice repeated. But it wasn't Mark's voice. It was mine. My voice. Exactly like mine. For a moment, I thought maybe it was some strange glitch, a mistake. I didn't know much about tech, but maybe the phone had picked up some kind of malfunction. But then, the voice repeated again. It was clearer this time, the same intonation, the same rhythm. Hello? I felt a chill run down my spine. Mark? I asked, still not quite understanding what was happening. And then, again, the voice on the other end responded. Mark? It was the same voice, my voice, asking the same question. It was as if I was hearing myself speak, but I wasn't speaking. I swallowed hard, my heart starting to race. My mind spun. This had to be some kind of error. A weird connection. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the fact that I was hearing my own voice come through the phone made my stomach churn. I glanced at the screen. The call was still from Mark, the same number, the same contact. Mark? I said, my voice shaking slightly. Are you there? The voice on the other end answered again. Are you there? It was me again. My voice. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a moment, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to stop hearing it, but some strange force kept me rooted to the spot. I brought the phone back to my ear. Who's there? I asked, my voice trembling with growing unease. The voice answered again, calm and even. Who's there? It wasn't Mark. It couldn't be. I could feel it in my gut. But I had to ask again, had to know if I was just imagining this. Mark? I asked once more, my voice desperate. Are you playing a joke on me? There was a pause. Then the voice responded, eerily calm. Are you playing a joke on me? That's when the panic started to set in. My breathing grew shallow, my hands began to shake. This wasn't just a strange malfunction. It felt wrong. Like the phone was playing tricks on me, like it wasn't even a phone anymore. I looked at the call log. It was still there, Mark's name, the call duration. I was too shaken to really process it, but I had to know. I pressed the home button and swiped through the apps, trying to get to the call history. And that's when I froze. There was nothing. No record of the call. I quickly opened the recent calls section again. There should have been a log of the call. It was empty. Completely empty. I looked back at the phone in my hand. I could still hear the voice on the other end repeating the same questions as if it had been there all along, waiting for me to hear it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who or what I was speaking to. And I wasn't sure how long it would go on, but I couldn't hang up, couldn't stop listening, even as the voice, my voice, continued to call out to me. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. The call had never come from Mark. It had come from me. And it wasn't just a glitch. It was a warning. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the phone, trying to make sense of what was happening. My hands were trembling, my breath shallow. My mind was racing. How was this possible? How was I hearing my own voice, repeating my own words? I checked the call log again, but it was still empty. There was no sign of any incoming or outgoing calls. But the voice, my voice, kept speaking. The same words. Over and over. Who's there? Are you playing a joke on me? I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I pressed my ear to the phone again, trying to hear something, anything, that would explain this. But there was nothing but that familiar voice, my voice, repeating the same questions in an unnervingly calm tone. My mind was spinning. There had to be an explanation. Some kind of technological glitch, a malfunction, maybe even some weird phone hack. But everything about it felt wrong. Deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. I tried to speak again, to break the cycle, to reach out to whoever, or whatever, was on the other end. Mark? I said, my voice cracking. Please, answer me. What's going on? But instead of a response, I heard my own voice answer, as if mocking me. What's going on? My pulse quickened. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a trick. The voice didn't sound like Mark. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. It sounded like me, but colder, emptier, like it was speaking from a place that wasn't real. I pulled the phone away from my ear again, staring at it, desperate to understand. I turned the device over, checked the back, tapped it gently as if expecting something to change. Nothing. The screen remained dark. The call had ended, but my own voice still echoed in my head, like a ghost trapped inside my mind. Who was that? I whispered to myself. The words hit me harder than I expected. Who had I been talking to? Who had been answering? It felt like some piece of reality had cracked open, exposing something I wasn't meant to see. I paced around the apartment, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. I looked at the clock. It was late. My mind was foggy, and I felt like I was caught in a loop, unable to break free. I needed to talk to someone. To Mark. To anyone who could help make sense of this. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, my steps quick and urgent. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I couldn't stay there, trapped with that voice. I walked for what felt like hours, trying to clear my head. The streets were empty, the quiet streets stretching out before me like some sort of vast, silent void. I tried to call Mark again. I needed to hear his voice. To hear something that wasn't mine. The phone rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Finally, it clicked. But instead of Mark's voice, I heard my own. Hello, my voice said, as calm and detached as it had been on the phone earlier. I froze. No, this wasn't possible. I hadn't even spoken yet. I hadn't said a word. The voice on the other end repeated the question, hello? I pressed the phone to my ear, unable to do anything but listen, frozen in place as the voice continued. Who's there? It was me. I could feel it in my gut. It was my own voice. And yet, it felt like someone, or something, was using it to communicate with me. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that my voice was answering or the growing sense that something was watching me. Something was waiting. I needed answers. I had to find Mark. I had to. The sound of footsteps behind me stopped me in my tracks. I turned quickly, heart pounding, breath catching in my throat. But there was no one there. The street was empty, the shadows deep and still. I looked down at my phone again, unable to make sense of what was happening. I was starting to feel like I was losing control, like I was slipping into a place where logic didn't apply, where nothing made sense anymore. I checked the call log once more. Nothing. But then I saw it. Something new. A message notification. It was from Mark. I opened it with trembling hands. The message was simple, but the words sent a shiver down my spine. Who are you? I didn't know how to respond. How could I? I wasn't sure anymore who I was talking to. And worse, I wasn't sure who I was either. The voice. The phone. The message. It all felt like a twisted game I wasn't prepared to play. I needed to get to Mark. I needed to understand what was going on. But as I turned to leave, I felt the unmistakable weight of someone or something behind me. I didn't dare turn around. My heart raced, my feet frozen to the pavement. The shadows around me seemed to stretch longer, like they were creeping toward me. Every instinct told me to run, but my body refused to obey. I could feel the cold, prickling presence behind me. Something was there, but I couldn't see it. The message on my phone blinked again, a single line that felt too heavy to read. I couldn't ignore it. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I hesitated. Part of me feared what I might find, but another part, a darker part, needed to know. I opened the message from Mark. The words blurred as I read them, but they were unmistakable. Who are you really? I stumbled back, almost dropping my phone. The voice I had heard on the other end, the voice I had thought was my own, now it was talking to me through a text. The message didn't sound like Mark. It didn't even sound like a question. It was an accusation. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew it wasn't a glitch. This was something worse, something I didn't understand. I quickly scrolled through my contacts, pressing Mark's name with trembling fingers. It rang, as it had before, and again it was answered by the same cold, empty voice that wasn't Mark's. Hello? I slammed the phone shut, unable to listen any longer. My hand shook uncontrollably. Something was wrong, something in the world had cracked, and I was stuck inside it, unable to escape. The footsteps, soft but deliberate, continued. They echoed in the empty streets, growing closer. My breath caught in my throat. I knew, without looking, that there was someone following me, but I refused to turn around. Just keep moving. Get away. But where could I go? The streets felt endless, stretching into nothingness. I had walked for so long, yet it seemed like I hadn't moved at all. I glanced at the phone again, the text from Mark still haunting me. Who are you really? What did it mean? I wasn't sure. Maybe this wasn't even Mark. Maybe it was something else, something impersonating him, something that had somehow taken his place, or mine. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like this wasn't just a phone call or a message. It felt like the world itself was wrong. The air was heavier, the night darker. The buildings around me weren't the ones I remembered. The streetlights flickered in a pattern I'd never seen before, and the further I walked, the more unfamiliar the surroundings became. The world was bending in ways that didn't make sense. This isn't real. It can't be real. I tried calling Mark again, praying that this time his voice would come through. Maybe the glitch had been temporary, and now everything would go back to normal. Please, I whispered under my breath. Please be okay. The phone rang once. Twice. And then it clicked. Hello, said the voice. I recoiled. It was still the same voice, not Mark's, but mine. I closed my eyes, a shiver crawling up my spine. It wasn't just that it sounded like me. The voice had the same tone, the same inflection, the same pauses and breaths. Everything was exactly like mine, but it lacked something. It was hollow. I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight, the words caught. I couldn't breathe properly. "Who are you?" I croaked, desperate to get some answer. "You know who I am," the voice replied, a tone of certainty that made my skin crawl. "You're not supposed to be here. You never were." I stumbled back, my mind unable to process the words. Not supposed to be here? What did that mean? "Where is Mark?" I managed to say, almost pleading. The voice paused for a moment, as if considering the question. "Mark is gone," it said, with an eerie calmness. "But you are still here." I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. My mind was spinning. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was real anymore. My surroundings had changed again. The buildings around me had started to shift, slowly and imperceptibly. The streetlights flickered, but now they cast strange, distorted shadows. The path in front of me was no longer familiar. Everything felt like a bad dream that I couldn't wake up from. I looked around, searching for a way out, but there was no escape. The world felt suffocating, closing in around me. The phone call was still connected. That same haunting voice was still there, speaking softly in my ear. "I can't escape. I can't wake up," I whispered, realizing that I wasn't just physically trapped. I was trapped in a world that wasn't my own. And then I heard it. A soft sound, faint at first, like a whisper in the dark. It wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from behind me. A faint rustling, the sound of something shifting in the shadows. I turned, my pulse racing. But all I saw was a figure, barely visible in the dim light. A shape, just a silhouette. "Who's there?" I called out, but the voice that answered wasn't mine. "Who are you?" the figure asked. Its voice was chillingly familiar. It was my voice. I took a step back, terror seizing me. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, I realized something horrible. It looked just like me. The figure took another step, its movements eerily synchronized with mine. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, my heart hammering. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There, standing before me, was a perfect reflection of myself, except the eyes were different. Hollow. Lifeless. "Who are you?" I repeated, but my voice felt foreign. It wasn't my own anymore. It was something else, something detached from me, echoing like a ghost from a place I couldn't understand. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it just smiled. A smile that was too wide, too unsettling. It wasn't a grin of recognition, but one of something darker, something predatory. I turned away, desperate to escape. But as I took a few steps, I realized I wasn't moving forward. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, bending like wet clay. The world around me warped. The buildings melted into abstract shapes, and the streetlights flickered, their light growing dimmer, casting long, twisted shadows. My pulse raced. My body was screaming for me to leave, but the air was thick. It felt like I was walking through water, slow, heavy. I turned back to face the figure, but it was gone. The street was empty. I stood still for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. Was I imagining this? Was my mind playing tricks on me? My heart was still pounding in my chest, my hands clammy with sweat. The voice, the distorted version of mine, still echoed in my mind, asking, "Who are you?" I glanced down at the phone in my hand. The screen was still on, still showing the last call, Mark's number, but this time, the call was still active. The voice, my voice, answered again. "You don't belong here," it said. "None of you do." I nearly dropped the phone as the words sank in. My entire body went cold, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread creeping up my spine. Something wasn't right. The world wasn't right. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But the question gnawed at me, where is here? I spun around, searching for a way out. The street seemed endless, and the further I walked, the more distant the familiar world became. The buildings stretched farther apart, becoming unrecognizable. I reached for the nearest door, yanking it open with shaking hands. But instead of finding the safety I was hoping for, I found nothing. It was an empty, featureless room. No furniture. No walls. Just an endless void that stretched out before me, darker than night. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and the world around me shifted once again. Suddenly, the phone rang again. My heart stopped. The screen displayed Mark's name, but there was no picture this time, just the cold blackness of the screen. I answered the call almost out of instinct, but all I could hear was my own voice, distorted and hollow. "I'm sorry," the voice said, echoing as if it came from all directions at once. "You weren't supposed to be here." I felt my knees buckle beneath me, and I sank to the floor, panic consuming me. "What do you want from me?" I managed to gasp. The voice laughed, the sound sending a shiver through my entire body. It wasn't Mark. It wasn't even a person. It was something else. Something pretending to be me. "You already know," it said. "You've always known." Tears blurred my vision, and I couldn't stop them from falling. What was happening to me? What was this place? I stood up shakily, clutching the phone in my trembling hand. The screen flashed briefly before turning black again. And when it lit up, the reflection of my own face stared back at me. But it wasn't just my face anymore. It was different. The expression was twisted, distorted in a way that felt alien to me. I could feel it. Something was watching me, something not human, something that knew me better than I knew myself. The ground beneath me trembled. The lights flickered. The air around me was dense, suffocating. I could hear footsteps again. But this time, they were not my own. They were coming from every direction at once. My reflection, the one on the phone, began to move as if it were alive. It reached out toward me, its hand extending beyond the screen as if to pull me into the void with it. A scream formed in my throat, but before I could let it out, the room around me dissolved completely. The door, the walls, the city, all gone. I was falling, tumbling through nothingness. And then I heard it. A voice. My voice. "Who are you?" But this time, there was no answer. Only silence. I woke up gasping, my body drenched in sweat. My hands still clutching the phone, the screen now cracked, the call long over. I looked around. I was back in my apartment. The street outside my window was peaceful, quiet. But something had changed. I could feel it. Something had followed me back. I checked my phone again, but this time I didn't need to see the screen. I knew. The number wasn't Mark's. It was mine, and the message that appeared on the screen made my blood run cold. Where are you, really? I froze, staring at the screen. The message stared back at me, mocking me with its simplicity. Where are you, really? It didn't make sense. How could it be for me? How could it know? I reached for the phone with trembling hands, the glass cold against my fingertips. The world around me seemed to blur, the room closing in on itself. My breath was shallow, each inhale coming in ragged bursts, as if the air itself was growing thinner. I checked the time, 2:31 a.m. But it felt like it had been much longer. Time had lost all meaning. I didn't want to look at the phone. I didn't want to acknowledge the fact that it had somehow turned against me. But I couldn't stop myself. The screen flickered again, the message still there, taunting me. Another message popped up, this one more sinister. I'm right behind you. My spine stiffened, and I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. The room was still. Empty. Nothing. No sound except the beating of my own heart in my ears. I had to stop imagining things. There was no one here. It was just the fear, the stress, the confusion. But then, there it was. A whisper, barely audible, like the air itself was speaking. Look closer. My hands were shaking now, my mind racing. I could feel the weight of something pressing down on me, like an invisible force pulling me toward the phone. My reflection in the screen was distorted, twisted. It looked wrong. My face was pale, the eyes too wide, the mouth stretched in an unnerving grin. I stumbled back, dropping the phone onto the floor with a sharp crack. I tried to catch my breath, forcing my mind to focus. It's just a phone, I told myself. It's just technology malfunctioning. Nothing more. But then I heard the footsteps again. The unmistakable sound of soft, deliberate steps, closer this time. And they weren't mine. They weren't my own footsteps. I turned slowly, my eyes darting around the room. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows in the corners of the room growing darker, more suffocating. I was no longer alone. There was something in here with me. Something watching. I stepped backward, almost tripping over the edge of the coffee table. The footsteps were louder now, echoing off the walls. It's not real. It's not real, I repeated to myself, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. And then, a voice. A cold, familiar voice. You can't escape. I whipped around, and there it was, the figure from the street, standing in my doorway. Its eyes, empty and black, locked onto mine. Its smile was impossibly wide, stretching across its face like a grotesque mask. But it wasn't just standing there. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, taking steps toward me, the floor creaking under its weight. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. No words came out. The figure's lips moved again, but this time the words weren't just spoken. They were felt, like vibrations deep within my chest. You're not supposed to be here. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me. I hit the ground hard, scrambling away as the figure took another step. The air around me thickened, pressing down on me with an unbearable weight. My vision blurred. The room seemed to stretch, warping in a way that shouldn't have been possible. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a lamp, and hurled it at the figure. The lamp passed right through it, as if the figure wasn't even there. There was no resistance. No collision. It was like trying to touch smoke. The figure's smile grew wider, almost inhuman. The air seemed to grow colder, and I felt a chill deep in my bones. I had to get out. I had to leave. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. The front door, was just a few steps away. I lunged for it, hands shaking as I fumbled for the handle. The door was locked. It wouldn't open. I twisted and pulled with all my strength, but it stayed shut, mocking me. The figure was getting closer now, its presence suffocating. I turned back to the room, to the phone lying on the floor. It buzzed once, and the screen lit up again. A new message. You're already gone. And that's when I realized. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. The walls, the furniture, everything had shifted. The air itself was wrong. It felt foreign. Like I was standing in a place I didn't belong. A place that wasn't real. The figure moved closer, its movements slow, deliberate. Each step was like a hammer against my skull. The air hummed with an unnatural energy. The world was slipping away, and I had no way to stop it. I backed away from the door, toward the corner of the room. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The phone buzzed again. Another message. But this one wasn't from the reflection anymore. It was from me. You never left. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble, the walls closing in once more. I was no longer sure if I was awake or trapped in some terrible nightmare. The figure was inches from me now, its black eyes staring into mine. And then everything went dark. The phone in my hand fell silent. The room was gone. There was nothing. Just nothing. Have you ever felt like something just isn't right, but you can't quite put your finger on it? Like when you're lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, and you hear a sound that makes your skin crawl? Maybe it's just the wind or an old house settling, but your mind starts to wonder if it's something more. That's how it started with Mrs. Klein. I never paid much attention to her before. She lived in the apartment next door, one of those people who keep to themselves. You hear her occasionally, a murmur of movement or a soft knock on the door when deliveries came. But beyond that, she was a ghost. Always quiet, always alone. It was around the middle of last month when I noticed something strange. I couldn't sleep one night, just lying there in my bed, when I heard the door to Mrs. Klein's apartment open. It was almost midnight. The soft click of the handle, followed by the quiet rustling of her footsteps as she left. I thought it was odd, but people have late nights sometimes, right? I figured she was just taking out the trash or going for a walk. But the next night, the same thing happened. And the next. Every night, right around midnight, she would leave. She didn't stay gone long, only an hour or so, but it was enough to make me curious. I had no reason to suspect anything sinister, but the repetition of her behavior started to feel off. I started paying more attention. Each night, right as the clock struck 12, I'd hear her leave. The door would creak open, and her footsteps would fade into the hallway. Sometimes, I'd lie in bed, pretending to sleep, wondering where she went, what she was doing out there in the dark. The apartment complex was old, with narrow hallways and creaky floors. It was easy to hear the sounds of the building at night, but Mrs. Klein's movements were always strange, quiet, deliberate, as though she didn't want anyone to notice her. I couldn't help it. The curiosity gnawed at me. I wasn't the type to get involved in other people's lives, but this was different. Something about the whole situation just felt wrong. It wasn't until the fourth night that I decided to follow her. The air was thick with the kind of stillness that only comes in the dead of night. I waited in the shadows, peering through the crack of my door as she stepped into the hallway. She was dressed in a loose, dark robe, her hair falling in a messy cascade down her shoulders. I had never seen her like this before. Usually, she was the picture of neatness, but tonight there was something almost untidy about her. She moved with an eerie calmness, her steps light but sure, like she knew exactly where she was going. I waited until she reached the end of the hallway and turned the corner before I slipped out into the corridor after her. I moved quietly, my breath shallow, the dim light from the hallway lights casting long shadows on the walls. Mrs. Klein was just ahead, her figure moving steadily down the stairwell. I followed her at a safe distance, keeping as quiet as possible. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had to keep reminding myself that this was just my imagination. People do strange things. Maybe she was just a night owl. But the further she went, the more my gut twisted. She didn't head to the front door. Instead, she went out the back, through the side door of the building, the one nobody used unless they were trying to be unseen. My steps faltered. I hadn't expected that. I had never even used that door myself, except for when the building was undergoing maintenance. I paused just before the door, hiding behind the trash bins. Mrs. Klein didn't look back, didn't hesitate. She stepped out into the darkness of the alleyway, her robe fluttering behind her as she disappeared into the night. It was the first time I had seen her leave that door, and a chill crept down my spine. But what happened next is something I'll never forget. I waited for a while, thinking she would return, but the minutes dragged on. The night grew colder, and the sounds of the alley were eerily quiet. No footsteps, no sounds of traffic, nothing. It was as though the world itself had gone to sleep. My fingers were numb from gripping the metal bin, and I started to wonder if I should just go back inside. Maybe I had misjudged the situation. Maybe I was just being paranoid. And then, I saw it. Out of nowhere, Mrs. Klein appeared again, only this time, something was wrong. She didn't come walking back down the alley like I had expected. She just vanished. One moment, I could see her dark robe in the distance, and the next, she was gone. No sound, no movement, nothing. As though she had simply dissolved into the night air. I blinked, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, before I stumbled backward, crashing into the bins. The sudden noise shattered the silence, and I quickly pressed myself against the wall, praying that she hadn't heard me. But there was no sign of her. No trace. Not even a shadow. What the hell just happened? My mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. But no, it was real. I had seen it. I had seen her disappear. I ran back to my apartment, heart pounding. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it. I wasn't sure what I had just witnessed, but I knew one thing for certain, something was going on with Mrs. Klein. Something I couldn't explain. And I was going to find out what it was. The next few nights were a blur of sleeplessness and suspicion. I tried to shake off what I had seen, telling myself that it was just some weird trick of the light or my mind playing games on me. But no matter how hard I tried, the image of Mrs. Klein vanishing into thin air haunted me. I couldn't forget it. I couldn't stop wondering, where had she gone? I decided to watch her again. I wasn't going to let myself be consumed by fear, but I had to know if what I saw was real. It was irrational, I knew, but curiosity was taking over. I couldn't help myself. That night, I waited for the sound of the door creaking open. I sat in my living room, pretending to watch TV, but every minute felt like an hour. The seconds stretched on, my mind running through every possible scenario. Could it be that I had imagined it? Maybe Mrs. Klein was just a sleepwalker, or maybe she was involved in something strange and unexplained. Either way, I had to know the truth. Around midnight, the faint sound of the door opened. My heart skipped a beat. It was the same as before, the quiet click, the rustling of her steps in the hallway. I watched through the peephole in my door as she walked down the hallway. This time, I didn't hesitate. I followed her again, keeping a safe distance. I was determined to see where she went, what she was doing. But when I reached the stairwell, I hesitated. Something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but the air around me felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. Still, I pressed on, my footsteps soft and calculated as I followed her to the back door. I tried to calm my nerves, telling myself this was just a simple observation. I wasn't doing anything wrong. As she disappeared into the night again, I paused in the dark alley, watching from behind the trash bins. I had to stay calm. I had to know what was going on. But this time, nothing happened. No sudden vanishing act. I waited, counting the seconds, then the minutes. Silence. Nothing. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the darkness pressed in on me. Where was she? Then, after what felt like forever, I heard it. A faint scratching sound from behind me, something shifting in the dark. I whipped around, my heart racing. The alley was empty, completely still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The scratching grew louder, then stopped, replaced by the soft echo of footsteps that didn't belong to me. I spun back to the corner of the alley, expecting to see Mrs. Klein. Maybe she had returned and I had just missed her. But instead, I saw something else. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision, barely perceptible. It wasn't her. It was something much darker. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, began moving toward me. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. I had to get out of there. Now. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, the air in my lungs burning as I raced back toward the building. I couldn't look behind me. I couldn't risk seeing whatever it was that followed me. I had seen enough to know that I didn't want to know anymore. I reached my door, fumbled with the keys, and slammed it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands shook as I gripped the doorknob. What was going on? What was Mrs. Klein doing out there? And what was that thing that had been following me? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, but I couldn't ignore what had happened. Something dark was happening in that alley, something that I couldn't explain, and I was determined to figure it out. But just as I began to calm myself, there was a knock on my door. Soft, but distinct. A sharp, unsettling knock. I froze. Who could that be? I didn't move. I didn't say anything. The knock came again. Then once more. Steady, deliberate. As if the person on the other side knew I was there, knew I was listening. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to face whatever or whoever was on the other side. But then, from behind the door, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice. It was Mrs. Klein's voice. But it wasn't just hers. It was a perfect mimicry of my own voice, speaking in the same soft, measured tone that I had used to knock on her door just days before. Only this time, the voice was asking the same question I had asked myself earlier that night. "Are you still watching?" I felt a chill spread through my body. I couldn't respond. I couldn't make a sound. My mind was racing, but my body refused to move. How could this be happening? How was she using my voice? Then, a strange thought pierced my panic. What if I wasn't the one in control anymore? I couldn't move. The voice outside my door, my own voice, echoed in my mind over and over again. "Are you still watching?" It wasn't Mrs. Klein anymore. It was something else. Something that sounded like me, but wasn't. For a few moments, I stood there, frozen, my hand gripping the doorknob as if I could somehow stop what was happening by sheer will. The air in the apartment felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in around me. I didn't know if I should run or confront whatever was outside, but every instinct in my body screamed that I was not supposed to open that door. The knocking came again, slow, deliberate, each thud against the wood sending a shiver down my spine. "Are you still watching?" I forced myself to step away from the door, my heart thundering in my chest. There was no way in hell I was answering that. The last thing I needed was to engage with whatever was out there, especially if it was mimicking me. I backed away, eyes darting around the apartment, looking for somewhere to hide, somewhere to feel safe. But it was pointless. No matter where I went, I couldn't escape the fact that something was wrong. I could feel it in the air. The silence felt too heavy, too thick, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The quiet that followed was almost worse than the sound itself. I stood there, waiting, straining to hear anything that might tell me what was happening. But nothing came. It was as if the world had gone still, holding its breath. Then came a sound I hadn't expected. A faint creak. The floorboards in the hallway outside my apartment. I froze again, my breath hitching. My first instinct was to check the peephole, but I hesitated. I didn't want to see anything else. Not tonight. But curiosity, fear-driven curiosity, took over, and I slowly moved toward the door, pressing my eye against the peephole. What I saw made my stomach turn. Mrs. Klein was standing in the hallway, just outside my door, her face a blur of shadow and light. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there. And then, through the dim light, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Her eyes were staring straight at me. I couldn't breathe. I felt paralyzed. How could she possibly know I was watching? She tilted her head slightly, and for a brief, terrifying second, I thought she was smiling. But then the shadows shifted, and I saw it. It wasn't her smile. It was my own face staring back at me, twisted into a sickening grin. I stumbled back from the door, my legs shaking. The image of that smile, that expression, burned itself into my mind. I didn't understand. It didn't make sense. How could it be my face? How could I be looking at myself through the peephole? Panic surged in me, and I bolted to the window, yanking back the curtains to find some escape. The street below was quiet, nothing out of place. No signs of life. Just the usual emptiness of the night. But as I looked out into the darkness, a sudden thought hit me with brutal clarity. What if this was all happening because of me? I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and the realization made my chest tighten. What if I had somehow opened a door into something I wasn't supposed to see? What if, in my pursuit to understand Mrs. Klein's strange behavior, I had invited this madness into my own life? A loud bang from the hallway jerked me out of my thoughts. I rushed back to the door, heart racing. I didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't know who or what I was dealing with. But I was certain of one thing: I was no longer in control. The banging stopped, and for a moment, the apartment was still again. But the silence was shattered by a sound I knew all too well, my own voice, coming from the hallway. "Open the door," it said. "You know you want to." I stood frozen, my hand hovering over the doorknob again. But this time, it wasn't just the voice that terrified me. It was the realization that whatever was out there, whatever was speaking through me, wasn't just imitating me, it was me. I stepped back, my breath shallow. Who am I? Then, without warning, the door flew open. I didn't touch it. I swear I didn't. It just opened, as if someone had unlocked it from the outside. And in the doorway, standing in the dim light of the hallway, was myself, or something that looked exactly like me. It wasn't Mrs. Klein anymore. She was gone. In her place stood a perfect copy of me, staring back at me with my own eyes. It stepped into the apartment without a word. I stumbled back, heart in my throat. No, 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 this can't be happening. But the figure didn't speak. It just stood there, looking at me, as if it was waiting for something. I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to do. And then, just as I thought my mind might snap, it smiled. A twisted, dark smile. And suddenly, I understood everything. It wasn't just Mrs. Klein who had been disappearing. It was me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The figure in front of me, myself, didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me with an intensity that sent chills running through my body. The smile on its face was wrong, too wide, too perfect, and yet somehow, it seemed to distort in the dim light. It was me. But it wasn't. I took another step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. My mind raced, scrambling to make sense of what was happening. I'd been watching Mrs. Klein for days, tracking her strange, nightly disappearances, but this was something else. Something far worse. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence grow. It was suffocating, like the air in the room was slowly being drained, leaving nothing but the cold weight of its stare. I looked at the door, my only way of escape, but the figure was blocking it. If I tried to get past, what would it do? Would it let me go, or would it just take my place like it had taken Mrs. Klein's? The smile on its face stretched even wider, the corners of its mouth pulling unnaturally far. My skin crawled. There was no sign of recognition in its eyes, no humanity. It was like staring at a mirror, but seeing something more sinister looking back. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, but no words came out. I couldn't make a sound. My throat felt like it was closing up, suffocating me. Then, as if sensing my panic, the figure took a step toward me. The air around it shifted, heavy, thick, like the atmosphere itself was becoming more distorted. I could hear the faintest sound, like a whisper, but it wasn't words. It was a pull, a low, unnatural hum that seemed to emanate from the figure. It was a sound I recognized, my own voice, but distorted, warped. The voice from earlier, the one that had been calling to me from outside the door. "You can't run, it seemed to say without moving its lips. The voice echoed in my mind, louder than anything I ever heard before. You can't hide. We're the same now. I shut my eyes, my heart racing. No, I wasn't the same. I wasn't like it. It wasn't me. But as I opened my eyes again, I realized something terrifying. It wasn't just mimicking me. It was me. Every movement, every subtle expression, it was like watching myself, my exact self, but twisted. The face was mine, but it felt like it had been peeled away, leaving behind something hollow. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt weak beneath me. The room seemed to close in, and I stumbled, my back hitting the wall. My reflection in the mirror on the far wall seemed to twist, blur, and I couldn't tell anymore where the figure ended and I began. The reflection shifted, flickered. Was I the one who had been here all along? My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the floor, my mind reeling. I could hear it breathing, my own breath, but too slow, too heavy. It was mimicking my every movement. And the worst part was, it was getting closer. With a shake of my head, I pushed myself off the ground. I couldn't let it get any closer. This thing, this shadow of myself, it was all I could focus on, and yet, in the corner of my mind, another thought flickered to life. What if I was the one who had been here all along? The hum grew louder, like a vibration that shook the room, pulling at the edges of my thoughts, making them twist and fray. I looked at the figure, paralyzed by fear. I couldn't escape it. Then, as I stood there, my hands gripping the floor for balance, I realized something truly horrifying. The door was still open, but it wasn't the only one. The walls, the very space around me, seemed to be breathing too. The edges of the room bent, stretched, like the apartment itself was changing shape, warping on itself. It was like the very fabric of reality was peeling away, revealing something darker, more dangerous beneath. I turned around, searching for something, anything, that could help me. But there was nothing. Just the same twisted reflection of myself in the dark. Then, suddenly, the figure moved. Fast. It rushed forward, grabbing my arm with a grip that felt like iron. I struggled, gasping, but its hold was unbreakable. The room spun around me, and I could hear the voice in my head again, louder this time. You can't run from yourself. We're one. I twisted in its grasp, trying to free myself. My heart thudded in my chest, the sound deafening in the small apartment. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to break free, but no matter what I did, it was always there. It was me. It was part of me. I managed to pull my arm free and stumbled back, my chest heaving. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I ran. I had no plan. No way out. I just ran through the apartment, down the hallway, across the apartment complex's stairwell. I heard footsteps behind me, the same rhythmic sound, my own, matching my every move. I could feel the walls closing in, the space around me warping, distorting, as if the apartment itself were changing, shifting into something else entirely. I made it to the front door, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the lock. But when I opened it, when I stepped outside into the hallway, I froze. The hallway was different. It was longer than it had been before. The walls were darker, more suffocating. And at the far end of the hall, I saw her again, Mrs. Klein. She was standing there, just like before, but now there was something more. Her face, her eyes, it was me again. My heart stopped. My breath caught in my throat. And then I realized with sickening clarity there was no escape. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, I was trapped. Trapped in a nightmare of my own making. And there was no telling how far it would go, how much of me would remain. It was too late. I had become one of them. The darkness around me seemed to grow thicker as I stared down the hallway. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, pounding with a frantic urgency I couldn't escape. Mrs. Klein, or whatever she had become, stood at the end of the hallway, still and silent, her eyes locked on me. No. Not her. Me. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, I thought I heard my own voice, a whisper so quiet it could have been the wind. But there was no wind. Only the sound of my own breath, quick and shallow, matching the rhythm of the footsteps that followed me. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight, like it had been sealed shut. It was as if the apartment was closing in around me, the walls pressing together with an invisible force. My legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground, but I had to move. I had to get out. I turned and ran, but the hallway stretched longer with each step, impossibly endless. The walls seemed to close in, the space warping, twisting into something unrecognizable. I could no longer trust my own senses. Every corner I turned felt like a different place, a different version of the same place. The door I had opened was no longer there, and the stairwell, once familiar, was now a distant, unreachable blur. I glanced behind me, and there she was again. Mrs. Klein, or whatever had taken her place, was moving toward me, but she wasn't walking. She was gliding, like she was floating. No sound. No footsteps. Just an unsettling silence that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Her face, my face, was frozen in that sickening smile, a grin that seemed to stretch further than any human face could possibly manage. "You can't escape, you know," the voice whispered from behind me. It was my voice. Only, wrong. We're already here. I spun around, panic taking hold. I had to get out. I had to. My eyes darted around the dark hallway, searching for something, anything that could help me. But all I saw were the walls, closing in, getting tighter, suffocating me. The apartment was alive. It was moving, breathing, shifting in ways that weren't possible. I slammed my palms against the walls, desperate to feel something solid, but it gave way under my touch. The surface was soft, almost flesh-like, and I recoiled, stumbling backward in horror. But then I heard it. The soft, rhythmic sound. Like breathing. But it wasn't mine. It wasn't hers. It was coming from everywhere. The sound of the walls themselves. Breathing. Watching. I turned, frantic now, and saw it. In the distance, standing at the end of the hallway, was another figure. Just like Mrs. Klein. Just like me. It was identical. The same features, the same unsettling smile. But there were more now, many more. Each one was a distorted version of me. My face, my body, all standing motionless, watching me. They weren't human anymore. They were reflections. Echoes of myself, broken and twisted, reaching out with their empty stares. I was surrounded. "You're not real," I whispered to myself, trying to convince my mind that this was just a nightmare. But the words felt hollow. They didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. The laughter started. Soft at first, a low murmur that seemed to seep from the very walls. Then it grew louder. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was all the voices. My voice, her voice, everyone's voice, merging together into a maddening cacophony. I clutched my head, my hands shaking, the pressure building like something was trying to crack open my skull. The hallway was closing in around me, the figures, myself, closing in. I could hear the sound of footsteps again. My footsteps. Their footsteps. Our footsteps. All one. I screamed. The sound was swallowed by the laughter. The darkness. The figures. And then, nothing. An eerie, deafening silence. I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't feel anything. I was alone. But I wasn't. There was a soft whisper in the silence. You're not alone. The voice, my voice, seeped into my mind, wrapping itself around my thoughts like a noose. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth moved, but the words were trapped inside. The silence stretched on, endless. And in that silence, something shifted. A cold presence. A hand. A cold, familiar touch on my shoulder. I turned, but there was nothing there. Yet I knew. I could feel it. The truth. I had never been alone. I had never left. This place, this nightmare, was my own creation. The apartment, the hallway, the twisted reflections, they were all parts of me. Parts of what I had become. And now, there was no escape. The last thing I felt was the touch of a hand, gentle but cold, wrapping around my wrist. A voice, my voice, whispered, "Welcome home." And then, all went black. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.